Chapter 1. The Summoning. Haha. I did it. I finally succeeded. Who would have thought that a randomly summoned soul from another world could perfectly fuse with the egg of an Iphiash? In a small, sealed room, the floor and walls were covered with mysterious symbols. Thin streams of light flickered and flowed across them, emanating an aura of mystery and eeriness. At the center of the room, a tiny white egg, no larger than a fingernail, floated midair. It swayed gently up and down, as if suspended by an invisible force. Standing nearby was a humanoid creature, no taller than 1.5 meters, dressed in a peculiar long robe. It flailed its arms and danced excitedly. Dole was ecstatic. The Iphiash, known as the infinite evolution insect, was a legendary creature capable of endless adaptation and transformation. As it matured, its appearance could change drastically, with almost no two individuals resembling one another. The ancient book he had found detailed only the characteristics of the egg. Illustrations of the adult forms were marked as hypothetical. It was said that even the Iphiash themselves might not recognize members of their own species. This unique trait severely hindered their reproduction. Rumor had it that they could only produce an egg under extremely rare circumstances, often at the end of their lifespan. Their harsh reproductive conditions led to their extinction long ago, but this flaw couldn't overshadow their once mighty power. When fully grown and in energy-rich environments, they could rapidly evolve to survive even the harshest conditions. With careful nurturing, a mature Iphiash could rival the power of a Tier 5 Grand Sorcerer. In the current era, where the strongest sorcerers on the continent were only a Tier 3 high rank, such a being would be akin to a god, capable of unifying the entire continent. Dole, a Tier 2 high rank sorcerer, had reached this level 3 centuries ago. Back then, he was a rising star among his people, hailed as the genius most likely to achieve Tier 3 status before turning 100. During his youthful days of fame and fortune, he stumbled upon the Iphiash egg during a seemingly routine exploration of ancient ruins. Among his companions, only he recognized the egg's extraordinary origins, thanks to a stroke of luck and some obscure knowledge. Thus, he acquired it at a meager cost. From that moment on, Dole became obsessed, devoting himself entirely to hatching the egg. He dreamed of one day unleashing a Tier 5 pet beast to sweep aside all obstacles and dominate the continent. Unfortunately, fate seemed to mock him. After countless experiments, he furiously discovered that although the egg's larva remained intact, its consciousness had long since dissipated over the endless passage of time. Driven by desperation, Dole scoured ancient texts and conducted endless experiments. At first, his efforts were within reasonable bounds, but as years turned into decades, his mind grew more unhinged. His methods became increasingly extreme and cruel. A once brilliant sorcerer, whose cultivation had stagnated for decades, inevitably attracted attention. Investigations soon uncovered horrifying revelations. Over the span of several decades, more than 100 of Dole's apprentices and servants had mysteriously disappeared. Moreover, he was implicated in numerous cases of illegal human trafficking. Left with no choice, Dole fled with the egg, continuing his experiments while living on the run. He hoped to one day reactivate the egg and reclaim his dreams of glory. 200 years passed. The once arrogant and high-spirited youth had become a stooped old figure. His once thick green hair had thinned to a stubborn tuft clinging to the sides of his ears. But persistence paid off. A few years ago, during another exploration, Dole obtained a blueprint for a summoning array. After some modifications, he used the egg as the array's core. Several trials later, today marked his first successful summoning of a soul from another dimension capable of perfectly merging with the egg. With the soul's infusion, the larva within the egg could finally be revived. His 2 centuries of effort had not been in vain. Soon, those who had driven him from his home would pay the price. Meanwhile, outside the rocky mountain where Dole had hidden, dozens of black-robed figures stood facing each other. "Captain, we've detected traces of a concealed magic array here. Upon investigation, it appears to be Dole's handiwork. However, to avoid alerting him, we didn't act rashly, so we can't confirm whether he's still inside," one of them reported. The captain nodded and directed his team to set up a containment array to surround the mountain. Once all preparations were complete, he raised his hand. A wand slid out from his wide sleeve, which he then gripped tightly. Chanting an incantation under his breath, the energy around him began to boil. A beam of green light shot out from the wand's tip, striking the mountainside. The scenery twisted and distorted, revealing its true form. A deep, dark cave appeared where the mountain had once stood. Inside, Dole, who had been reveling in his success, felt the sudden surge of foreign energy from outside. Just as he turned to investigate, he realized his concealment array had been breached. Years of evading pursuit had made him highly experienced in such situations. Though this lab was only a temporary setup, he had prepared multiple escape routes. As long as even one remained unblocked, he could still escape. Quickly stowing the egg, Dole dashed into a tunnel. Minutes later, his expression turned ashen as he returned to the lab. The surrounding space had been sealed by an unknown magic array, forming an invisible cage that trapped him. Even though a path seemed open ahead, an invisible barrier blocked the way. From outside, the captain's voice rang out. Dole, did you really think we'd let you escape again without preparation? Surrender now and hand over the Ifiash. Lord Leon may still spare your life. Leon, once Dole's defeated rival, had been the first to uncover his human experimentation. Now, after 2 centuries, their roles had reversed completely. While Leon's initial motivation may have been simple vengeance against the man who had overshadowed him, he had long since uncovered the truth. His purpose had shifted entirely. Justice for the victims was now little more than a hollow excuse. The Ifiash was worth any cost. Dole scoffed at Leon's offer of mercy. Surrendering the egg would only guarantee his silence through death. With no way out, Dole came to a desperate decision: to overload the elemental furnace powering the summoning array. The resulting energy surge would reverse the array's operation, teleporting him out instead. Since the array could summon souls from another dimension, surely a mere containment array couldn't stop it. As for where he would end up, that was in the hands of fate. Survival was better than certain death. Resolute, Dole began casting protective spells on himself. Multicolored lights flared around his body. As for the egg, its unhatched Ifiash larva was protected by its seemingly ordinary but impenetrable shell. Outside, the captain remained patient. His master had assured him that Dole lacked the means to destroy the Ifiash egg. Thus, he chose a cautious strategy of containment over confrontation. After all, even a cornered old sorcerer might prove dangerous. But the captain's caution proved futile. A blinding white light erupted. The captain, his team of black-robed sorcerers, and the surrounding area were instantly obliterated, leaving behind a hemispherical crater over 10 kilometers in diameter. As for Dole, he had overestimated himself. A mere Tier 2 sorcerer stood no chance against the explosion of an overloaded elemental furnace. He was vaporized in the first instant. Only the Ifiash egg remained, vanishing in a flicker of light as the summoning array disintegrated. When Luo Wen regained consciousness, his mind was in turmoil. He had just been taking a quick break at work, closing his eyes for a moment to rest. Hours of staring at a computer screen had left his eyes dry and sore. But the next thing he knew, he had fallen asleep, and inexplicably woken up in this bizarre situation. He found himself trapped in a dark, slimy prison, surrounded by sticky, disgusting liquid. What kind of prank was this? Sleeping on the job didn't warrant something this extreme. Luo Wen tried to shout, but no sound came out. He attempted to move, but realized with horror that his arms and legs seemed to have multiplied. Frozen in shock, it took him several seconds before he began thrashing wildly. Finally, the prison couldn't withstand his struggles and cracked open. Luo Wen scrambled out through the opening. All around him were enormous rocks, but now that he was free, he felt an inexplicable surge of strength, far beyond what he should have. With ease, he pushed the surrounding stones aside, creating a small space for himself. What kind of reality show was this? Had they locked him up and buried him alive? Still groggy from whatever had happened to him, Luo Wen's thoughts remained scattered. But it didn't take long for the horrifying truth to dawn on him. Staring at his hands, if they could still be called that, Luo Wen froze. They were smooth, pitch black, and gleamed with an almost metallic sheen. Instead of fingers, strange jointed appendages protruded from them. Looking down at his body, he saw the same black surface. His abdomen had sprouted 2 pairs of segmented limbs, and his torso extended into a segmented tail. He was no longer human. Chapter 2. Newborn. Luo Wen curled up into a ball, unsure of how long he stayed in that position. Suddenly, he felt something atop his head moving instinctively. A sweet aroma wafted toward him, and an unbearable hunger clawed at his stomach. Great, just let me starve to death already, he muttered, forcing himself to resist the tempting scent. Luo Wen tried to calm his mind, planning to die by starvation. However, the objects on his head moved more frequently and forcefully, grating on his already frayed nerves. Glancing upward, he was startled to find 2 stick-like appendages swaying wildly in front of his eyes. What the hell? I actually grew a pair of antennae. His despair deepened. 10 minutes later, a small black insect was seen crouched beside a massive white egg, devouring it with gusto. The tiny bug was only half the size of the egg, but its tiny mandibles worked furiously. As its saliva coated the shell, the once hard surface rapidly softened. Between bites, the insect also slurped up the egg's viscous interior, alternating between solid and liquid. A perfect combination of hard entree and soup. Damn, this tastes amazing. Luo Wen exclaimed. It wasn't that Luo Wen had caved to hunger. No, he told himself it was all to silence the distraction. The gleaming white egg stood out starkly against the pitch-black surroundings, drawing his attention incessantly. Combined with his new vision, which seemed fundamentally different from his past human eyes, the whole thing was making him dizzy. Now that he'd decided to eat this culprit, he could concentrate better, and a full belly might even give him more energy to starve himself properly later. By this point, Luo Wen had pieced together some semblance of understanding about his current situation. In his previous life, he had been a well-informed young man exposed to an onslaught of online media, science fiction dramas, web novels, you name it. What he hadn't expected, however, was that his previous life would end so abruptly and that this new life would begin just as unceremoniously. Worse still, he had transmigrated into a bug. Yes, he now understood what he had become. But bugs usually hatch in clusters, don't they? So why was he alone, without any companions? This lack of a reference made it impossible for him to gauge what he looked like. Was he intimidating and awe-inspiring? Or just a plain old creepy crawly? Luo Wen suspected that whatever that green-haired old man had done, or perhaps some innate instinct of the insect body itself, was responsible for his current state. In just one meal's time, Luo Wen had already begun to accept his reality as an insect. He even found himself worrying about his image. After devouring more than half of the eggshell, Luo Wen was full, content, and even feeling a faint sense of happiness. For the moment, he gave up on his thoughts of suicide. When in Rome, do as the Romans do, he mused. If there was a second life, then maybe there could even be a third. At the very least, this was a unique experience. However, just as he was starting to comfort himself, adopting a more optimistic mindset and embracing the idea of living boldly, reality once again delivered a crushing blow. Perhaps his shift in attitude bridged the final gap between his human soul and his insect body. As the two harmonized completely, fragments of information stored within his new body suddenly surged into his mind. The infinite evolution insect. Ifiash. So that's what I am in this life. That actually sounds pretty badass. Wait a second. That green-haired, decrepit old bastard did this to me. Damn it. This wasn't an accident. It was a premeditated attack. If that's the case, my plan to die dramatically and start fresh in another life is completely out the window. Unfortunately, the insect body only retained a small amount of recent information. There were no miraculous bloodline memories or inherited skills, as seen in novels. Luo Wen absorbed what little there was, quickly piecing it together amidst his exasperation. Although the language spoken by that green-haired old man wasn't one Luo Wen had ever encountered, he somehow understood its meaning perfectly. Ra-oes. Ugh. Just let me die already. Luo Wen's budding optimism quickly evaporated as he curled into a ball once more. Half an hour later, Luo Wen found himself chewing on more eggshells while pondering his newfound insect life. Based on the final images stored in the body's memory, it seemed that he had been teleported away by that summoning array. This left him with 3 possible scenarios for his current location. He had been sent back to his home planet. He was still on that sorcerer-filled continent. He had landed in an entirely unknown place. Determining which of these was the case would require further observation. But for now, that wasn't his top priority. The surrounding environment, filled with massive rocks, hinted at extreme danger. Judging from the pitch-black surroundings, Luo Wen guessed he was underground. How deep? That, he couldn't say. Now that the white egg had been mostly consumed, the area was even darker. Yet his eyes could still pick up faint traces of a unique type of light. While this light wasn't enough to discern his surroundings in detail, his antennae and even the tiny hairs on his legs provided a strange kind of feedback, guiding him toward the surface. It was an indescribable sensation, one that Luo Wen could only understand through first-hand experience. Following this sense, Luo Wen began using his front legs to claw at the rocks ahead, pulling them toward his abdomen. His middle and hind legs then worked together to push the rocks behind him. Yes, he now had 6 legs. But as a bug, Wasn't that perfectly normal? At first, his movements were clumsy, but he quickly got the hang of it. Perhaps he had a natural talent for being a bug. As he dug his way upward, the surrounding rocks gradually grew warmer, until the heat began to make him uncomfortable. The light ahead brightened until, finally, Luo Wen broke through to the surface. And with it, his worst fears were confirmed. A vast expanse of yellow stone reflected the blinding sunlight. The scorching ground burned his abdomen and soft tail, making him feel like he was about to be roasted alive. As he had feared, he was in a desert. The rocks around him were nothing more than coarse sandstones. If he hadn't somehow arrived in a land of giants, it meant his body was extraordinarily tiny. Sure, being small was normal for a bug. But for a former human with zero experience as an insect, this was a living nightmare. Braving the searing heat, Luo Wen surveyed his surroundings. Not a single trace of vegetation was in sight. His field of vision, however, was bizarre. It reminded him of those massive advertisement screens in shopping malls, assembled from dozens of smaller screens that worked in sync to create a seamless image. In his case, it wasn't dozens of screens, but thousands, maybe even tens of thousands, densely packed together to form his view of the world. Based on his limited knowledge of entomology, he guessed that he now possessed a pair of compound eyes. Again, normal for a bug. But nobody had told him that compound eyes came with extreme nearsightedness. Up close, everything was crystal clear. But anything farther away was a blurry mess. He couldn't even make out the sun to determine whether it was the same one he had known from his previous life. Still, using some mysterious, insect-specific sense he couldn't describe, he determined that there was only one light source in the sky. The novelty of these abilities was something no human could imagine. Not that Luo Wen was grateful for the experience. He would have gladly passed on it. Given the limited information he'd gathered, the scorching surface temperatures, and the potential dangers of the unknown, Luo Wen's paltry 3 to 4 meter visual range left him feeling deeply insecure. If there was no next life to look forward to, he decided he might as well make the most of this one. His plans for a dramatic death could wait. Survival came first. With his rear end raised, Luo Wen began burrowing back underground. The act of digging felt almost instinctual. In no time at all, he had mastered various excavation techniques, digging up, down, left, and right with ease. Once he reached a sufficient depth, the temperature cooled considerably. Exhausted from the physical exertion of digging and the emotional toll of his situation, Luo Wen finally allowed himself to rest. Curled up in the darkness, one final thought echoed in his mind as he drifted off to sleep. I refuse to live with nearsighted eyes. Chapter 3. Searching for food. When Luo Wen woke up again, he noticed that the temperature around him had dropped slightly. His stomach growled with hunger, but the eggshell was long gone. It baffled him that an eggshell twice his size had only been enough for 2 meals. He had no idea where all that food had gone. From this, however, he could deduce one thing. His appetite was massive. And while the saying goes, a good appetite is a blessing, it was anything but for Luo Wen in his current situation. The surface was a barren desert, and there was no sign of food anywhere. If this went on, he might starve to death in just a few days. The thought lit a fire under him. He had to find food. He refused to die a starving insect. Relying on his antennae and sensory leg hairs to orient himself, Luo Wen began clawing his way toward the surface. The further he climbed, the colder it became. He began to wonder if he was heading in the wrong direction, but his antennae and leg hairs insisted otherwise. With no other options, he gritted his metaphorical teeth and pressed on. Well, technically, his head was already hard, and black, too. When he finally emerged from the sand, he froze in shock. The golden desert was gone, replaced by a silvery layer of frost covering the ground. For a moment, Luo Wen wondered if he had somehow teleported again. What is this place? The temperature difference between day and night is insane. It was night now, and the dim light barely illuminated his surroundings. Strangely, Luo Wen found he could now see up to 5 or 6 meters, much farther than before. Was he a nocturnal bug? He wasn't sure. Even with his improved vision, the cool light source in the sky was still too blurry to discern. However, he could sense something else. There were 2 of them. 2 distinct light sources hung in the sky. During the day, there had only been one light source, giving Luo Wen hope that he might have been sent back to his home planet. But now, that hope was completely shattered. Based on his limited knowledge of astronomy, Luo Wen could reasonably conclude that at least 2 moons were orbiting this planet. Still, he accepted this reality rather quickly. After all, he had already been turned into a bug. What was one extra moon in the sky compared to that? The last few days had thrown so many shocks his way that he was starting to become numb to it all. His original 3 possibilities had been reduced to 2. He was either in the sorcerer's world or some other unknown realm. He just hoped it wasn't the sorcerer's world. That place seemed far too dangerous for a little bug like him. For now, though, survival took precedence. If he didn't find food soon, he wouldn't live long enough to figure out where he was. While no food was in sight, the frost-covered ground offered a potential source of water. Luo Wen decided to fill his belly with frost for now and worry about food later. His mouthparts extended, a little longer than he expected, with a mushroom-like cap at the tip. The cap spread flat and adhered to the frosty surface, while tiny hidden teeth scraped rapidly against the ice, grinding off small shavings. Aided by his tongue, yes, bugs apparently had tongues. Much to his horror, he sucked the ice particles into his body. Luo Wen had no idea what he looked like while eating, and he didn't want to know. He simply followed his instincts and let his body do the work. After a long while, all he'd managed was a shallow depression in the frost. His eating efficiency was dismal, but with no other options, he kept going. The cold liquid trickled into his stomach, and Luo Wen began to feel his entire body stiffen. His thoughts turned sluggish, and his fading consciousness brought back an old human memory: wintertime, when mosquitoes and flies mysteriously vanished. That's when it hit him. He was a bug now. Bugs don't survive well in the cold. And here he was, out in freezing weather, drinking ice-cold water. Was he trying to kill himself? Panicked, Luo Wen snapped out of his stupor and scrambled back underground along the path he had come. This place is insane. Too hot during the day, too cold at night. When am I supposed to go out looking for food? He had planned to scout the area a bit more after drinking his fill, hoping to find something edible, but now that was out of the question. Once he was safely back underground, Luo Wen didn't feel like resting anymore, nor could he afford to. He needed to find a reliable food source as soon as possible. If the surface was too dangerous, then he'd look underground. He had an incredible talent for digging, after all. It would be a waste not to use it. Determined, Luo Wen picked a random direction and began tunneling. His antennae twitched constantly as he worked, sending him both new sensory experiences and useful information. They seemed to function as both a nose and ears, allowing him to detect smells and hear sounds. Midway through his digging, his antennae picked up a strange scent from the lower left. The unfamiliar smell stirred hope in Luo Wen. It could mean food. Excited, he quickened his pace, tunneling toward the source of the scent. But as the smell grew stronger, Luo Wen's caution returned. He was here to find food, not to become someone else's meal. At the moment, his body was still tiny, smaller than a typical housefly, and he had only just been born. He hadn't had any time to learn bug-style combat skills. If he encountered a living creature capable of fighting back, there was a good chance he'd lose. Better to be careful and think things through. Focusing on his insect instincts, Luo Wen's body became hyper-alert. The fine hairs on his legs, and even those covering his entire body, stood on end. The vibrations coming from the front left filtered through his senses and coalesced into information in his mind. After analyzing it, he came to a conclusion. There were living creatures ahead, likely 3 or 4 of them. They were moving slowly and seemed smaller than him. It should be safe to check them out, but if anything went wrong, he'd run. There was no shame in retreating. He didn't know anyone here, so who cared if he lost face? Carefully, Luo Wen clawed at the sandy soil in front of him. His digging techniques proved less effective here. The loose sand he had been working with earlier was easier to handle. The firmer, more compact soil presented a challenge. Thankfully, this area wasn't fully solid. It was a mix of sand and soil. While it slowed him down slightly, he could still make progress. The soil's better structural integrity also worked in his favor. It allowed him to create stable tunnels, which he reinforced as he went. He carefully moved the displaced sand and soil to the looser layers above, ensuring a clear escape route if things went south. After some effort, Luo Wen had dug a tunnel just large enough for his body to pass through. This way, he could retreat quickly if needed. As he drew closer to his target, his movements became more deliberate and his body tensed further. Finally, after scraping away another layer of dirt, a round, plump, white translucent bug rolled into view. The creature's body was segmented into over 10 sections, though only the first few bore 3 pairs of stubby limbs. Its yellowish head looked rather harmless, but Luo Wen was horrified to see it had a pair of huge mandibles. The bug was about the same size as Luo Wen, perhaps slightly smaller. Suddenly unearthed from the soil, it squirmed helplessly, curling and stretching its body while emitting faint hissing noises in an attempt to scare Luo Wen off. Watching the little white bug struggle to flip itself upright, Luo Wen's fear melted away, replaced by growing confidence. He sneered inwardly. Oh, you think I'm scared of you just because you've got a pair of big teeth. Think again, little guy. Chapter 4. White Grubs. Reality proved that even though Luo Wen wasn't afraid of the white grubs, his current weaponry and equipment were utterly useless against them. The white grubs' skin appeared delicate and transparent, as if it could break with a single poke. However, it was incredibly tough, at least from Luo Wen's perspective at the moment. His striding limbs, small claws, and proboscis-like mouthparts were powerless against the white grubs. At this moment, he couldn't help but envy their massive fangs. Watching the fat white grub roll around incessantly as if mocking him, "Come on, do your worst," Luo Wen felt his frustration rise. If he were still human, he could have crushed the white grub into a burst of pulp with just 2 fingers. But thinking about it, the notion felt revolting, so he quickly dismissed the thought from his mind. Suddenly, a realization struck him. The presence of this white grub here meant there had to be food nearby, otherwise, it wouldn't be so lively and energetic. Just you wait. I'll eat up all your food and starve you to death. Let's see how cocky you'll be then. Luo Wen glared menacingly at the white grub. Without paying it any further attention, he resumed digging. Before long, he unearthed a few more siblings of the white grub. This discovery irritated Luo Wen even more. Why did other insects live in colonies, yet he was all alone? After brushing these annoying worms aside, the soil crumbled to reveal the food they had been guarding. A section of an unknown plant's root emerged from the dirt. Its grayish-brown surface bore several fresh bite marks. Judging from the shape, Luo Wen guessed they had been left by the white grubs. He pressed his proboscis against one of the wounds on the root and began licking. A trickle of liquid slid down his tongue into his esophagus, eventually reaching his abdomen. After only a few licks, the wound stopped oozing. Luo Wen switched to another wound, but each dried up after only a few tries. By the time he had licked his way around the root, he was only about a third full. Attempting to enlarge the wounds with his mouthparts proved futile. After some thought, he shoved one of the rolling white grubs next to the root. As expected, the mindless creature immediately sank its fangs into the food, creating a fresh wound from which tantalizing sap flowed. Luo Wen promptly kicked the worm away and took over the spot for himself. Thanks to the assistance of his tool bug, Luo Wen finally managed to satiate his hunger and quench his thirst. Feeling full and satisfied, he nudged the tool bug back toward the root and kicked the other white grubs even further away. Returning along the tunnel to the sandy layer above, Luo Wen decided to rest. The digging earlier had drained a significant amount of his energy, and the discovery of food had eased his anxiety, allowing him to relax. As for why he chose to travel all the way back to the sandy layer instead of resting near the root, Luo Wen feared that, despite the white grubs' herbivorous appearance, they might still bite him on a whim. With his small limbs, those massive fangs could easily sever them. Even if they didn't attack him, waking up to find those fangs dangling in front of his face would be unsettling. After weighing the options, he decided it was safer to rest further away. When Luo Wen awoke again, he had no idea how much time had passed. His once full belly was now empty and growling with hunger. Trying to scratch his abdomen with his forelimbs, Luo Wen suddenly noticed something strange. A new pair of limbs had grown in front of his original forelimbs. These new appendages looked incredibly strong. Their ends resembled rake-like claws, with 4 stubby, robust prongs slightly curved inward. Iphiash. Infinite evolution insect. Luo Wen thought of the term inexplicably, and its meaning became clear to him. Before sleeping, he had grumbled about how ineffective his small claws were for digging through dirt. Upon waking, he had grown a pair of limbs that were perfect for the job. For a moment, his thoughts wandered to a game he'd played in his previous life, where there was a type of self-destructing insect. Luo Wen wanted to slap himself. What was he thinking? If he grew something bizarre while sleeping, something that exploded as soon as he woke up, where would he even go to complain? Still, what determined these evolutionary changes? Next time he rested, he would need to give it serious thought. But for now, filling his stomach was the priority. The new rake-like limbs proved to be exceptionally efficient. The prongs easily penetrated the soil, dislodging large chunks with each motion. Strangely, Luo Wen noticed his sense of direction had improved dramatically since becoming an insect. In his human life, he was notoriously bad at navigation, relying on GPS even for short trips. Now, in this pitch-dark underground maze where every direction looked the same, he instinctively knew where to go. He quickly found his way back to the previous tunnel without taking a single wrong turn. Some parts of the tunnel had collapsed, but what had taken great effort to dig through with his small claws before was now a breeze with his new limbs. He now had 8 appendages, though he had never paid much attention to insect anatomy in his previous life. While he had killed his fair share of flies and mosquitoes, he'd never bothered counting their legs. Insects came in so many varieties, and having more legs seemed normal. Take centipedes, for example. He remembered a childhood story about a centipede putting on shoes, which his kindergarten teacher used to tell before nap time. He had never stayed awake long enough to hear the centipede finish. Of course, those legs were natural. His, on the other hand, seemed to grow based on need. Luo Wen worried about what he might turn into if this continued, but then he laughed at himself. He was already an insect. Why worry about appearances? It wasn't as though insects had dating standards, he thought. Then again, who knew? He hadn't met any others of his kind yet, so he had no idea what insect aesthetics were like. Suddenly, another thought struck him. Was he male or female? Did insects even have that? He tried feeling for something but found nothing. Could he be a female? If he were still human, his face would undoubtedly have gone pale at this realization. Distraught, Luo Wen reached the plant root again, only to find the white grubs feasting gleefully. Fury surged within him. He rushed forward and kicked them away one by one. Licking the delicious sap while watching the white grubs squirm and roll in frustration, Luo Wen felt much better. As expected, happiness is built on the misery of other insects. Chapter 5. Exploration. Iphiash the infinite evolution insect. When adequately fueled, they can adapt to harsh environments through rapid evolution, ensuring their survival. But what if a bug's constant melancholy and desire for death compromised this evolutionary drive? Could Luo Wen's current optimism be linked to his ability to evolve? Luo Wen didn't know and didn't care to think about it deeply. One way or another, he had quickly and naturally accepted his new identity in a short amount of time. More importantly, he had already begun taking proactive steps to improve his quality of life. For instance, instead of returning to his original path after eating his fill, Luo Wen chose to dig deeper underground to construct a new nest. With the help of his newly evolved rake-like appendages, he could burrow into a denser layer of soil further below, where the earth was more compact and structurally sound, reducing the risk of collapses. In just half a day, he excavated a chamber roughly the size of a ping-pong ball. Given that his body was smaller than a fingernail, the room felt quite spacious. He lined the floor with dry sand and stones to keep the ground from becoming damp, though he wasn't sure if insects could get arthritis. Once his new home was complete, Luo Wen dug several connected tunnels leading to it. Some served as main entrances, while others were emergency escape routes. These pathways interlinked, and their entrances were sealed with dirt, making it difficult for any intruders to find them. Additionally, he dug out a separate area as a latrine, far from his main chamber. A long passageway connected it, lined with soft sand to block any odors from wafting back. This effort seemed excessive, considering Luo Wen hadn't relieved himself since his birth. Lying in his cozy new chamber, Luo Wen began contemplating his bug life. From his observations, it was clear that he possessed remarkable evolutionary abilities. However, the mechanism behind this evolution and its limitations remained unclear. So far, he had experienced only one obvious evolution, and there might have been others more subtle that he hadn't noticed yet. More time and data would be needed to uncover the full extent of his abilities. However, he didn't know how much time he had. From his limited knowledge of entomology, he was aware that most insects didn't live very long. Even though his species sounded impressive, he hadn't been given a manual at manufacturing to confirm how long he could survive. Moreover, this wasn't Earth, and he wasn't an Earth species. The knowledge from his old world might not even apply here. After much thought, he ended up where he started. Without enough information, everything was just speculation. Still, he recalled his previous trip to the surface. While he couldn't measure the temperature precisely, it had definitely been below freezing. He had spent a fair amount of time outside, even drinking lots of cold liquid, yet aside from some discomfort, he had bounced back after a nap without any ill effects. If an insect on Earth endured such conditions, it would likely end up partially paralyzed. This suggested that his current situation couldn't be measured by earthly standards, especially given his patchy and dubious knowledge. Having exhausted his train of thought, Luo Wen managed to kill some time through pure imagination. In his previous life, Luo Wen had been inseparable from his phone. Reading, browsing videos, anything to pass the time. Now, without such distractions, he found the hours unbearably slow and realized he needed to find new activities. No sooner had he thought this than he acted. After a moment of consideration, Luo Wen decided to eat again. He had worked hard moving to his new home and needed to celebrate with something good. With the reluctant help of his tool bug, Luo Wen soon had his fill. But once again, boredom set in. Not wanting to rest just yet, he decided to dig along the route he'd been feeding on, curious to see where it led. During his previous trips to the surface, he hadn't noticed any vegetation, partly due to his extreme nearsightedness. His curiosity about what desert plants on this alien planet might look like drove him forward. Following the route, Luo Wen discovered more of the white grubs, siblings along the way. From the looks of it, they were a large family. Luo Wen felt no envy. Numbers didn't matter when they were all just a bunch of foolish tool bugs. The path sloped upward gradually, and Luo Wen had no idea how long he had been digging when he encountered a much thicker root. It turned out the previous route was merely a lateral offshoot. As he continued, more roots branched out, their numbers increasing until they became a dense network of large roots spreading into unknown regions. The temperature around him rose steadily. Fine, thread-like roots began to appear, distinctly different from the larger ones. As he dug upward, the surroundings grew brighter. It seemed to be daytime above. Having already experienced one day-night cycle, Luo Wen could now estimate the time based on the light levels underground. Slowing his pace, Luo Wen became more alert, his fine hairs standing on end as he cautiously scanned his surroundings. Underground, his digging speed gave him a clear advantage. On the surface, however, even a fingernail-sized opponent might overwhelm him. Near his new home, soil at this depth had already transitioned to sandy layers. Here, however, possibly due to the dense root network, the soil remained compacted, without any signs of sandification. This layer presented new dangers. Through vibrations in the ground, Luo Wen could sense numerous hollow tunnels surrounding him. These were more intricate than the passages he had constructed at his home. Within them, he detected movements and sounds of unknown creatures. Carefully avoiding these passages, Luo Wen continued his slow ascent. Finally, after breaking through a shallow layer of sandy soil, he reached the surface. It was indeed daytime. Beside him stood a cluster of massive weeds, with more scattered around. Most of their leaves had withered and yellowed. It seemed the fine roots he had seen earlier belonged to these plants. In the distance loomed a colossal tree. By Luo Wen's rough estimate, it would take hundreds of him linking arms to encircle the trunk. This excursion yielded several revelations. First, Luo Wen discovered he wasn't nocturnal. In daylight, he could see as far as 5 or 6 meters. It seemed his repeated wish not to be nearsighted had been granted. His vision had improved significantly. Still, it wasn't enough. The towering tree, for instance, was mostly a blur. He could only make out part of it. Details like its height, leaves, flowers, or fruit remained beyond his sight. Clearly, his vision still had room for evolution. Secondly, Luo Wen noticed that he wasn't as affected by heat as before. Whether this was due to increased heat resistance or the shade of the tree remained to be seen. He made a mental note to find a sunny spot later for comparison. Finally, he discovered the owners of the underground tunnels. Among the weeds, several ant-like creatures appeared. They were yellowish-brown, with round heads, long antennae, 6 slender legs, and disproportionately large, hook-like mandibles that were half their body size, distinctly menacing. These creatures surrounded Luo Wen in an unfriendly manner. Using the small pores on his rear as a makeshift gut instinct, Luo Wen guessed they weren't here to welcome him. Chapter 6. Under attack. As it turned out, Luo Wen's earlier suspicion about the small hole near his rear end was correct. The ant-like creatures were exceptionally aggressive. One of the closest ants swayed its antennae, its 6-jointed limbs slightly bending before springing forward all at once, launching itself right at Luo Wen. Its hooked mandibles lifted slightly before clamping down in a swift motion, aiming to lock onto him. Of course, Luo Wen wasn't about to roll over and take it. While his compound eyes were terribly nearsighted, their thousands of lenses forming individual images gave him excellent dynamic vision. To put it into perspective, if a human eye found watching a screen with a 60 Hz refresh rate smooth and lag-free, Luo Wen's dynamic vision was 10 times better. For him, that 60 Hz screen would seem like a slideshow, stuttering between frames for what felt like an eternity. Yet, the ant's launch speed was so fast that it exceeded the reaction threshold of human vision. Even for Luo Wen, while he could track its movements, there was no bullet time advantage. He quickly used 3 of his elongated striding limbs on one side to kick against the ground, propelling himself into a roll and narrowly avoiding the attacking mandibles. The close call left Luo Wen drenched in cold sweat. His current insect body lacked the flexibility of a human's. Movements humans could execute with ease, such as rolling, were tremendously taxing for him. This time, he was lucky. After rolling twice, he ended up belly down, still sprawled on the ground. If his push-off had been weaker, or if any other mishap had occurred leaving him flipped belly up, it would have spelled disaster. In his current form, flipping over was a monumental task, leaving him entirely at the mercy of the ants. One-on-one, Luo Wen felt he could handle these ants, which were slightly smaller than him. But clearly, they had no intention of fighting fair, showing every sign of ganging up on him. Discretion being the better part of valor, Luo Wen raised his rear and prepared to flee. On the ground, he couldn't match the ant's speed, but he had his own advantage. Despite his short tenure as an insect, he had already observed that while their forelimbs were adequate for clawing at sand and gravel, they were woefully unsuited for digging through soil. The ground here was layered with loose sand and gravel, but beneath it lay soil. If he could burrow into the soil layer, he'd be safe. Unfortunately, Luo Wen underestimated the ant's launch speed and range. Several ants leapt simultaneously, their mandibles clamping onto him just as half his body disappeared into the dirt. 2 even pierced his abdomen, collectively pulling to drag him back out. If they succeeded, it would be game over for Luo Wen. Determined to survive, he desperately clawed at the ground with his digging limbs, braced his midlimbs against nearby gravel, and kicked frantically with his hind legs. One of the ants gripping Luo Wen's abdomen surged forward. In addition to its conspicuous hooked mandibles, it had a pair of smaller, pincer-like black-brown jaws near its mouth. Luo Wen's flailing hind leg happened to strike directly in front of its jaws. The ant reacted quickly, snapping down on the leg. Whether other insects felt pain, Luo Wen didn't know, but he was sure of one thing: he currently had no pain sensation. Otherwise, with his injuries, a human body would have passed out long ago from the agony. As if this weren't enough, some of the ants stabilized themselves with their 6 legs, raised their thoraxes vertically, and stretched their abdomens forward until they were even with their heads, resembling scorpions about to sting. Their swollen abdomens pulsed, and from the nozzle at the tip, a turbid liquid spurted forth. Upon contact with air, the liquid emitted a wisp of white smoke. The liquid arced through the air, landing precisely around Luo Wen, splattering parts of his posterior abdomen. The contact caused small, pitted wounds as his body was corroded. Crap, Luo Wen thought bitterly. These shameless creatures are using fecal spray attacks. And it's toxic. I've never seen a species so devoid of honor. Faced with a life or death situation, Luo Wen seemed to muster strength from every fiber of his being, even his bristles standing on end. After a desperate struggle, he finally broke free, burrowing completely into the gravel layer and disappearing from view. Once underground, Luo Wen left the ants far behind. They couldn't even catch a glimpse of his rear hole. Now temporarily safe, Luo Wen stopped. Exhausted, he found himself in a pitiful state. Both his hind legs bore bite marks of varying severity, one of them broken in the middle and missing a large segment. Fortunately, with so many legs, losing 2 wasn't a significant hindrance to his mobility. His posterior half, while affected by the corrosive spray, didn't sustain as much damage as he'd feared. Likely, the brief exposure and limited dosage caused only superficial injuries, sparing his internal structure. Unable to see his own back, Luo Wen could only sense that the damage wasn't too severe. However, the wound on his abdomen was another story. The soft abdomen had been torn open at the 3rd segment from the rear, leaving it barely attached to his body by a thin strip of skin. Internal organs, or whatever constituted them in his current form, had trailed out along the way, leaving nothing left to spill. Good thing I'm an insect now. If I were human and this gutted, I'd definitely be dead. Even though he wasn't dead yet, Luo Wen had no idea how much longer he could hold on with such severe injuries. But there was little he could do. No bandages or gauze were available, and even if they were, his current limbs couldn't manage the dexterity for such tasks. What he wouldn't give for access to the internet right now, to post his predicament and tack on a desperate plea: urgent, need help. But that was wishful thinking. Luo Wen suspected these idle thoughts were a sign he was nearing death, his mind starting to wander. Vibrations sensed by his bristles snapped him back to reality. The ants were tracking him by the trail of fluid his wounds left behind. This place was no longer safe. Raising his rear again, Luo Wen resumed digging. Earlier, he'd noticed that the ants and their tunnels didn't extend to the deeper underground layers. It seemed they preferred not to live there, and their forelimbs were ill-suited for excavating soil. If he continued downward, he could lose them for good. Luo Wen had no idea how long he had been digging. His consciousness began to blur. Though he felt no pain, his grievous injuries left him physically and mentally drained. Through the haze, he sensed familiar vibrations ahead, white bugs gnawing at tree roots. Using the last of his strength, Luo Wen crawled forward. Sure enough, a fat, white grub was using its large mandibles to strip bark and feast on the succulent sap. Without hesitation, Luo Wen kicked the grub aside and latched onto the wound in the tree root, furiously licking at the sap. The cool, slightly sweet liquid flowed down his throat into his body, reaching his abdomen, only to leak out through his wound. Luo Wen felt a wave of despair. Weakly, he burrowed a short distance to the side before his vision went black, and he lost consciousness. Chapter 7. Enhancements. When Luo Wen regained consciousness, he had no idea how much time had passed. Though he remained motionless, the bristles on his body informed him that the white grub beside him was still tirelessly gnawing at the tree root. Still an insect. Huh. How am I even alive after all this? He had harbored a sliver of hope, wishing that death might grant him a third life or return him to his previous one. Unexpectedly, this seemingly impressive insect species turned out to have an astonishing vitality. Despite being gutted, with food passing straight through his body without nourishment, he had somehow survived. It was truly unbelievable, but there was no time for amazement. A quick inspection of his body revealed that the 3 abdominal segments dangling from his abdomen had shriveled and detached, lying discarded nearby. The wound had healed, but no new body segments had grown to replace them, leaving his body visibly shorter. He couldn't see the injuries on his back, but they didn't seem to be serious. The wound on his broken hind leg had also healed, although it hadn't regrown. His hunger was now extreme. Since his rear had healed, this meant that the food he ate would now stay inside. Dragging his weakened body, Luo Wen forced himself back to the tree root. The white grub was still contentedly sipping sap. Without hesitation, he kicked it aside and moved in to feed. After licking his fill, he grabbed the white grub and opened another sap wound. Repeating this cycle several times, Luo Wen finally felt full. Having eaten his fill, fatigue overtook him once again. Ignoring everything else, Luo Wen dragged himself back to his hiding spot and passed out. Thus began a routine of waking, kicking the white grub, feeding, and collapsing back into unconsciousness. After countless repetitions, Luo Wen's spirit finally recovered. Around him lay scattered molts from his shedding. By now, his appearance had drastically changed. First, his eyes had grown significantly larger, taking up nearly half of his head. His field of vision had expanded dramatically, resembling a 360-degree wide-angle camera that allowed him to see even his own back. For the first time, Luo Wen could observe his back. Although he didn't know what it had looked like before, he noticed a small patch of hard armor there, while the rest of his long abdomen had been exposed. This vulnerability explained why the ants had been able to target his abdomen so easily. Now, his neck area sported an expanded shoulder plate that stretched to cover his sides, greatly increasing his lateral defense. That wasn't all. Behind this shoulder plate, a semicircular back plate had grown, shielding his shortened abdomen. His entire back now resembled a 7-spotted ladybug, except his back armor was solid black and covered with bristles. Ono Beta ES. His previously maimed hind leg had fallen off entirely, only to regrow, thicker and more robust than before, bristling with sharp spines. In addition, he discovered 2 new hind legs capable of bending in reverse. If he were to flip onto his back, his now rounder body might make flipping over even harder. But on the contrary, these new hind legs could press against the ground and push him upright. Lastly, his mouthparts had undergone a transformation. His previous lapping-sucking mouthparts had shrunk significantly, and now, as if driven by a subconscious desire to avoid relying on the white grub, he had grown the large mandibles he had longed for. He could finally drink sap independently. The myriad problems he had encountered in his prior struggles had all been addressed during this evolution. Luo Wen couldn't help but exclaim internally, "Ifiash, you're incredible." Even with his comprehensive enhancements, Luo Wen had no intention of immediately seeking revenge on the ants. Two fists couldn't fend off four hands, let alone the many hands the ants had. Through this intensive, multifaceted evolution, Luo Wen had gained a better understanding of his body. Firstly, evolution adhered to the principle of energy conservation, which explained his repeated need to eat throughout the process. Secondly, when faced with certain challenges, his body would instinctively activate the most suitable genes from its internal gene pool. Sufficient energy expedited this activation. For example, when he had trouble digging earlier, his recently replenished energy stores had quickly enabled him to grow digging limbs. Luo Wen sensed that as he continued to grow and mature, he might eventually be able to actively choose which genes to activate. The diversity of the gene pool, however, depended on the insect's mother. If the egg had been laid under ideal conditions, it would be stocked with abundant resources. The opposite was also true. Unfortunately, Luo Wen belonged to the latter group. Like most Ifiash offspring, he had been hastily laid as a last resort, leaving him with barely any genetic inventory. His pool only contained basic genes for digging, feeding, and minor resistances like fire and frost, just enough to survive the larval stage. But even this was sufficient. After surviving the vulnerable early stage, larvae would inevitably encounter a vast array of organisms, witnessing their unique strengths and abilities, and then selecting the most suitable ones to arm themselves. This realization led Luo Wen to reconsider. Perhaps his initial understanding had been wrong. The lack of advanced genetic material might not have been due to oversight but rather a deliberate, calculated decision. Every Ifiash's environment was unique, exposing them to wildly different organisms. Without first-hand experience, activating random genetic sequences would waste energy at best. At worst, it could result in maladaptive traits. Perhaps long ago, some Ifiash had recklessly activated untested gene sequences in response to difficulties, only to exacerbate their problems or even lose their lives. It was possible that leaving only basic genetic fragments was itself an evolutionary adaptation. Reflecting on this, Luo Wen felt the decision made perfect sense. It was as if someone had left a gene for self-destruction in the pool. If one day he desperately sought a quick way to boost power with minimal side effects, the gene pool, lacking wisdom, might instinctively suggest this extreme solution. Unaware of its function, he might activate it and wake up as a living bomb. Luo Wen maliciously speculated that some predecessors might have encountered such a fate. For now, Luo Wen could finally rest easy, no longer fearing that impulsive thoughts might lead to his doom. Chapter 8. Curiosity. So, how does one enrich their genetic library? The method was surprisingly simple. Pick a creature with desirable traits and eat it. The prerequisite, of course, was that you could defeat it in the first place. That's not simple at all. Luo Wen muttered under his breath. Fortunately, he had a creature on hand that he could easily handle. He began considering what traits the white grub might offer him. Its plump, white, soft body. Its sluggish movements. Its stubby, awkward limbs. So far, the only thing that had piqued his interest was its prominent mandibles, but he'd already grown his own pair. With that thought, Luo Wen realized that the only creature he could currently defeat had no practical value to him. He felt a twinge of frustration. But then he reconsidered. Perhaps there was some value after all. Meat offered far more energy than sap or plant roots. Luo Wen had long been curious about how the white grub tasted. Was it really like crispy chicken? Unfortunately, his previous mandibles had been too weak, and his claws too ineffective, to penetrate the grub's tough hide. Now that he had a pair of sharp mandibles, it was finally time to give it a try. The body of the Ifiash was subtly altering his mind. In his previous life as a human, he would never have dreamed of eating a grub, let alone raw. But now, he found the white grub's tender flesh surprisingly enticing. Looking at the grub before him, Luo Wen hesitated. This particular one was an old acquaintance, a trusty tool during his recovery. After a moment of hesitation, Luo Wen decided to let it go. I really am a kind-hearted insect, he sighed, quietly patting himself on the back. Digging a bit further, he soon unearthed another white grub. This one hadn't helped him at all. It wasn't a familiar grub, so there was no need to feel bad about eating it. Luo Wen's sharp mandibles tasted their first battle, and achieved resounding success. The grub's previously impenetrable skin was easily pierced. Ignoring its frantic writhing, Luo Wen extended his lapping and sucking mouthparts into its body. He quickly discovered a problem. His mouthparts needed further evolution. Eating meat was still awkward. These mouthparts were excellent for consuming soft substances, such as liquids or gels. However, when faced with anything tougher, like meat, they lacked the necessary strength. The grub gradually stopped struggling as its body deflated. Luo Wen withdrew his mouthparts and wiped his abdomen with his midlimes before moving to a tree root nearby. He bit into it and drank some sap, finally sated. The taste was decent overall, and Luo Wen nodded in satisfaction. From now on, he could officially consider himself a carnivorous insect. Leaving behind the drained husk of the grub, Luo Wen burrowed back to his self-constructed home. It looked exactly as he had left it. No unexpected visitors had dropped by. Lying in his chamber, Luo Wen began contemplating after his meal. Enriching his genetic library was definitely a priority, but it wasn't urgent. During this latest evolution, he had learned more about his body. Beyond his genetic repository, there was information about his lifespan. The Ifiash was, after all, an extraordinary species in this world. Even its larvae had a lifespan of at least a century, and as they matured, this lifespan would only increase. How long he could ultimately live was unknown, especially since continuous evolution would accompany his growth. What a mature Ifiash might become was beyond even the imagination of its progenitor. In this foreign land, any creature with a bizarre appearance or mysterious origin was often attributed to the Ifiash. Whether such claims were true or not was anyone's guess. Of course, the information Luo Wen had received made no such assertions. The insect that left these messages had no concept of time. It only knew it had lived for a very, very long time. Its method of measurement was peculiar. The rise and fall of 3 kingdoms. Luo Wen mulled over this for a while. A kingdom's establishment and collapse could hardly occur in a short span. Based on his knowledge from his previous life, 3 kingdoms, that could be an unimaginable length of time. History wasn't his strong suit, so he couldn't calculate precisely. Regardless, he now had an explanation for his lifespan, which eased his mind considerably. After all, he had always thought of insects as short-lived creatures. As for how that ancient insect managed to end its own existence, Luo Wen couldn't find any clues, even after repeatedly reviewing the information. Well, so be it. Luo Wen wasn't too concerned. He was only mildly curious. With the pressure of time gone and an ample food supply secured, he felt relaxed. The roots of the great tree spread over an unknown expanse, hosting countless white grubs. Given his current size, it would take a long time to consume them all. Furthermore, these grubs were clearly larvae of some other insect. What did their adults look like? How often did they reproduce? How long did it take for new eggs to hatch or larvae to reach their current size? Luo Wen realized he now had a long-term research goal. If these white grubs were a quickly regenerating resource, his food supply problem was effectively solved. As for the yellow earth ants, Luo Wen considered himself above holding grudges. However, now that he was an insect, vengeance was a given. He wasn't in a hurry, though. He decided to bide his time and grow stronger first. Even if he didn't evolve new abilities for a while, he could continue enhancing his existing genetic fragments. He could become stronger, his exoskeleton thicker, and his defenses and resistances more formidable. Those ants were the second species he had encountered in this unfamiliar world, and they represented an excellent source of genetic material. Their spring-loaded movements, hook-like mandibles, and feces-spraying magic attacks, all of these would be his eventually. Thinking about that last point made him annoyed. Everyone else was fighting hand to hand, and suddenly they pulled out a disgusting ranged attack. Who does that? Oh right, they weren't human. Still, if it weren't for those surprise attacks, Luo Wen was confident he wouldn't have fled so pathetically. He might have even taken a few of them down with him. Immersed in his imagination, Luo Wen's consciousness gradually drifted into darkness. A strange noise and intense vibration startled him awake. Luo Wen swiftly climbed to his feet. His fine hairs bristled as the bizarre sound persisted. Something was happening on the surface. Insects might not possess curiosity, but Luo Wen had the soul of a human, and humans were inherently curious, often dangerously so. After pacing a few laps, he couldn't resist his growing curiosity and decided to investigate. As he climbed, Luo Wen's thoughts wandered. Maybe 2 colossal beasts were battling it out above, and a few drops of their blood might accidentally fall on him, catapulting him to the pinnacle of insect life. He chuckled to himself. That's how these stories always go. The more he imagined, the more excited he became, quickening his pace. But as the saying goes, curiosity kills the cat, or in this case, the insect. When Luo Wen neared the surface, he realized the strange noise was merely howling wind. The vibrations were caused by sand whipping against the ground. Feeling a bit deflated, he decided to retreat. Suddenly, a sense of immense danger washed over him, causing his fine hairs to stand on end. Before he could react, a powerful force lifted him into the air, along with the surrounding sand and stones. Chapter 9. Severely injured. Luo Wen felt he had been too reckless. After realizing there was a storm outside, he should have retreated immediately instead of staying to daydream. Didn't he know that being a spectator came with risks? Now, not only had he been forced into a front row seat, but he'd also been dragged into the performance. If given another chance, he would stay in his burrow no matter what happened outside. He'd stake his pride on not moving a muscle. The sky was pitch black, with the ferocious storm howling like a ghost. It whipped up a barrage of sand and stones, which, under the storm's force, shot forward like bullets. Unfortunately, Luo Wen was directly in the path of the onslaught. Though his small body made for a minor target, the density of the sandstorm ensured countless particles still struck him. Luo Wen curled all his limbs toward his head, shielding his compound eyes with his digging limbs. The rest of his legs surrounded his head as best they could. He twisted his body to present his back to the storm's direction. His newly grown shoulder plates and dorsal armor offered considerable protection. Though he felt no pain, the fine hairs on his exoskeleton told him the sand and stones had not yet breached his defenses. Despite this, the relentless impacts sent his body tumbling through the air, making it nearly impossible to maintain balance. Amid the disorienting spins, his unprotected abdomen bore the brunt of the damage. The dorsal armor covered much of it, but the sandstorm's 360-degree assault spared no part of his body. His already shortened abdomen took another round of severe hits. Luo Wen didn't have the luxury of addressing his abdominal injuries. Nor did he bother keeping his back to the storm, as constant. Tumbling and the storm's unpredictable gusts rendered his efforts futile. Finally, he resorted to curling his neck, shielding his head with his limbs, and leaving his fate to luck. He'd survived an abdominal injury before, but a crushed head would mean certain death. He still had so much time to live, he didn't want his journey to end prematurely. The world around him was shrouded in darkness. The howling winds and flying debris disoriented him completely. Not that it mattered. He was quickly swept farther away by the storm. After an indeterminate time, during which even his tough dorsal armor began to sustain damage, Luo Wen noticed the wind's intensity lessening. It seemed he had endured the worst. But now, a new problem emerged. He couldn't fly. He'd only hatched a few days ago and hadn't had time to develop such capabilities. Even if he could fly, his tiny body would be powerless against the might of nature. At this moment, Luo Wen had no idea how high he'd been swept. His poor vision was useless in the dim, low-visibility environment. Even with his former human eyes, he doubted he could have seen much in these conditions. Eventually, Luo Wen felt himself descending. Thankfully, while the wind had weakened, it still occasionally lifted his lightweight body, cushioning his fall somewhat. His hollow internal structure made him lighter, and the semicircular shape of his dorsal armor acted like a parachute. By some miracle, he landed from an unknown height without sustaining significant impact damage. No wonder he'd never heard of insects dying from falls in his previous life. It turned out that even wingless insects possessed innate adaptations to survive such situations. After being blown around a couple more times upon landing, Luo Wen finally settled safely on the ground. Without pausing to assess his injuries, he immediately began digging into the earth. Thanks to years of watching disaster movies, Luo Wen knew tornadoes had calm eyes. But he couldn't tell if he was in the storm's eye, or even if this was a tornado at all. Not that he wanted to find out. He was just an insect now, focused solely on survival. Staying on the surface was a death wish. Only by burrowing deep underground could he find any sense of security. Luo Wen dug deeper than ever before, descending well past his previous home's depth. When he hit a layer of soil, he kept going, ensuring he was far below any potential surface threats. As he worked, he felt an overwhelming sense of frustration. Just when his life had started to stabilize, when he'd barely had time to enjoy his new home and the seemingly endless supply of white grubs, it was all taken away because he couldn't resist the urge to check out some commotion. Now, all he could do was lament his terrible luck. His injuries, however, were an even greater source of despair. One of his digging limbs was broken. Several of his mid and hind legs were either completely snapped or heavily damaged. The few intact ones had suffered varying degrees of wear and tear. His head and eyes, while protected, hadn't escaped unscathed. He noticed several black spots in his vision, likely caused by damage to some of his compound eyes lenses. He had no idea if they would heal. His antennae, left unprotected, had also suffered. Half of one was missing. The damage to his shoulder and dorsal plates was severe, with a large chunk of the dorsal armor completely gone. The worst injury was to his recently healed abdomen. Last time, he'd lost 3 segments of tissue, shrinking his overall size. While this time he didn't lose entire segments, many areas were severely damaged, exposing his internal structures. Yet amidst the despair, Luo Wen noticed something interesting. Within the hollow cavities of his abdomen were fibrous tissues that quickly patched the wounds, preventing fluid loss. It seemed this was a result of his previous evolution. The changes were internal and had gone unnoticed until now. Still, Luo Wen had no desire to discover these adaptations. Nevertheless, the fibrous tissues played a crucial role. While his abdominal injuries looked more severe than last time, the self-repair mechanism had stabilized the damage, preventing further deterioration. At least now, he wouldn't experience the grotesque phenomenon of food leaking out as he ate. With his remaining antennae and fine hairs raised, Luo Wen detected no unusual scents or vibrations. Sensing safety, he slowly closed his eyes. He needed rest, a chance to use his stored energy to begin healing. This time, his injuries were far worse than before. Almost every part of his body was damaged. Even his relatively protected head and eyes bore significant scratches and abrasions. The environment, too, was far more hostile than before. Last time, he'd had access to nearby food, allowing him to replenish energy during recovery. This time, though he'd recently eaten a white grub, the storm had drained much of his reserves. Moreover, his abdomen's ruptures, despite the fibrous patches, had still cost him some stored nutrients. At best, his current energy reserves were only half of their full capacity. Faced with these challenges, Luo Wen's body had no choice but to alter its recovery strategy. Chapter 10. Recovery. Deep underground, a black insect lay motionless, its body severely damaged and over half of it crippled, appearing lifeless. Suddenly, viscous liquid began seeping out of its body, through its eyes, mouthparts, and the base of the hairs covering its body. Under the influence of these liquids, the insect's black head, fragile eyes, delicate mouthparts, rotting abdomen, and even its sturdy shoulder plates and back armor underwent a miraculous chemical reaction, as if they were melting. White foam appeared, expanded, and then slowly hardened, eventually forming a cocoon-like structure resembling the black insect, but significantly larger. The cocoon completely encased the insect. Luo Wen's consciousness floated in the darkness, fluctuating as if he were drowning, his body being churned into pulp. The discomfort was suffocating, and he struggled desperately to escape his plight. Outside, the cocoon, shaped like a black insect, began to tremble as if something trapped inside was attempting to break free. The trembling intensified, growing faster and more vigorous until a crack appeared along the top of the cocoon. From the crack emerged a head, smooth, tender, and translucent yellowish white. It looked fragile, as if it would shatter at the slightest touch, with its internal organs faintly visible. The creature, through sheer effort, gradually forced its burrowing legs out. With these legs anchoring it externally, the tender insect soon managed to pull its entire body free from the cocoon. Exhausted from the struggle, the insect rested briefly on the cocoon. At this moment, its once yellowish-white, tender body rapidly turned black and hardened. Its outermost skin transformed into an exoskeleton, encasing its entire body. In the blink of an eye, it reverted to its black insect form. Luo Wen examined his body and found that he had shrunk significantly. The size he had nearly reached, a fingernail, had reverted to his original size at birth. Though no new organs or limbs had appeared, the damage to his body had been fully repaired. Even the black spots that had marred his vision were gone, and his sight was clear once more. His antennae waved, and the 2 identical length appendages swayed in front of his eyes, soothing his compulsive tendencies. This recovery was largely thanks to the white insect he had devoured. The newly activated cocooning ability drew much of its genetic material from it. Combined with some of Luo Wen's inherent genetic fragments, the fusion and refinement triggered by a life and death crisis had led to his current state. Simply patching together parts and organs from other insects would create an unsightly chimera. Only through fusion, refinement, and evolution could the abilities of Iphiash truly shine. Unfortunately, Lua Wen was still a larva and could not actively select which genetic fragments to activate, let alone integrate and refine them. This time's success was merely a lucky accident triggered by the instinct to survive as his life ebbed away. Regardless of the benefits, Lua Wen did not wish to attempt such a process again. He had no pressing goals to achieve, and surviving to reach maturity naturally seemed the proper course. Risking his life recklessly in pursuit of power was not a choice he would make. Though his body was fully healed, his energy reserves were critically low. The repairs had consumed not just his energy but even some of his bodily tissues, leaving him smaller overall. Lua Wen now needed to find food urgently. Without replenishment, his survival strategy of cautious endurance would be nothing but empty talk. He set his burrowing legs to work and chose a random direction to dig, as all paths seemed equally unfamiliar in this strange environment. Lua Wen's digging speed was impressive, though he felt he could go even faster. However, his newly evolved 360-degree panoramic vision, provided by his large bulbous eyes, was more of a hindrance than a help underground. It allowed him to see farther, but being surrounded by earth, it was nearly useless. Moreover, he had to divert attention to protect his fragile eyes while digging, significantly slowing him down. Upon reflection, he decided that slowing down wasn't necessarily a bad thing. This wasn't his familiar territory. He had no idea where he was or what dangers might lurk underground. Better to proceed cautiously. He reduced his speed further, employing his antennae and body hairs at full capacity to scan for potential threats. In the desert, resources were scarce. Lua Wen had been lucky to find suitable food near his birthplace. But that luck seemed to have run out. After burrowing for an indeterminate amount of time, his already dwindling energy reserves were nearing depletion, yet he had found no sign of food. Desperate, he decided to dig straight downward. Gradually, large rocks appeared around him. Following the crevices between the stones, he continued digging until the scattered rocks fused into a solid layer of bedrock. Suddenly, strong vibrations reverberated through the rock. His antennae detected dense moisture in the air, and the faint sound of running water reached his ears. Lua Wen deduced that there might be an underground river beneath the rocks. Guided by the moisture, he crawled toward the source. Before long, he found a small crack in the previously impenetrable rock layer, through which the sound of flowing water became clearer. Taking advantage of his small size, Lua Wen wriggled through the crack. As he progressed, the surrounding rock walls darkened and became slick with moisture, condensed from the dense humidity in the air. Black spots began to appear on the walls, resembling some kind of plant, perhaps moss. However, this wasn't his old territory, and their unusual color left him uncertain about their identity. In this environment, his burrowing legs were almost useless. Lua Wen used the hooked claws on his other 6 limbs to anchor himself to pits and grooves on the rock's surface. He extended his mouthparts, which formed a dish-like structure at the mushroom-shaped tip, and pressed them against the rock. Hidden fine hairs and a small tongue quickly scraped up the moisture. The cold underground water flowed into his esophagus and then his body, its minerals and microorganisms rapidly digested to replenish his depleted energy reserves slightly. Lua Wen drank until he could no longer stomach another drop, then rested nearby. Once he digested the water, he would resume drinking. However, relying solely on water to replenish energy was excruciatingly slow. Lua Wen drank until he nearly vomited and, for the first time since his birth, urinated. He had never urinated, even when he drank root fluids daily. This first experience was novel, though it wasn't his focus. Drawing from his past human experiences, specifically as a man, he knew that urination required certain organs. Naturally, as a newly insectal being, Lua Wen needed to examine his body after this unprecedented act. Chapter 11. Black Moss. The results were not promising. But with Lua Wen's limited knowledge of entomology, he couldn't be certain if insects even possessed such things. And even if they did, what would be the point? Setting aside whether there were others of his kind, what could he possibly do? Engage in some dubious reproductive activities with another insect. Moreover, in his memory, male insects usually met tragic ends. A children's film he watched growing up, one featuring a cat as the protagonist, contained certain scenes that remained a haunting shadow of his childhood. Shuddering, he forcibly interrupted the trajectory of his thoughts. Previously, he had assumed that the tiny opening at the tip of his rear end was an excretory outlet. That opening had been lost along with the 3 tail segments he had shed. Unexpectedly, A new one had secretly grown back, though it had remained unused and unnoticed. But even this time, it wasn't utilized. Instead, a small opening appeared in the middle of his lower abdomen for excretion, leaving the purpose of the rear end opening still a mystery. Drinking water to fill his stomach was barely effective, so Luo Wen turned his attention to the black moss-like plants around him. Were they poisonous? And how resistant was his insect body to toxins? Considering the grandiose name and reputation of his species, his reckless curiosity began to stir. A small taste shouldn't be an issue, right? He cautiously moved closer, using his burrowing legs to scratch at the black moss a couple of times. Nothing unusual happened. No mysterious gas released, no unknown liquid sprayed out, and the hairs on his limbs showed no signs of corrosion. He extended his mouthparts and lightly touched the black moss. No reaction. Then he used his small tongue to lick it. After waiting for a while, there was no numbness at the tip of his tongue. Finally, he carefully took a tiny bite, lying still afterward as a precaution. He experienced no ill effects. After gradually increasing the amount he consumed and lengthening the waiting period between tests, Luo Wen concluded that the black moss were edible and non-toxic, or toxic, but harmless to him. While the energy provided by plants couldn't compare to that from meat, it was certainly better than merely drinking water. After eating his fill, Luo Wen climbed up out of the crevice to rest. The walls of the fissure became smoother the deeper he went. His clawed limbs weren't well suited for traversing or resting on such smooth surfaces. Going deeper posed significant risks. If he lost his grip and fell, landing on rock might be manageable. But if he plunged into the underground river, who knew if he could swim? If not, that would be disastrous. Most insects have specialized tracheal systems and unique operational mechanisms, making it difficult to suffocate them but relatively easy to drown them. Unfortunately, Luo Wen's current body used such a conventional system. If he fell into the water, would Ifasha's adaptability allow him to evolve a new system in time to survive? Luo Wen decided that anyone else was welcome to try such challenges, he certainly wouldn't. The first rule etched into his code of conduct was, don't court death. Although Luo Wen aspired to grow powerful in isolation before venturing out, this clearly wasn't realistic. While the area provided food, the efficiency of sustenance was low. As his size increased, he'd likely spend most of each day just eating. Additionally, the black moss couldn't add new genetic elements to his abilities. Staying here would merely enlarge his current form proportionally, without gaining any new functions. Furthermore, he needed to learn more about this world. He couldn't just assume invincibility and recklessly roam, only to be met with a missile or disintegration spell right away. It was essential to observe while he was still inconspicuous. After much deliberation, Luo Wen devised a compromise. He would follow the underground river's flow to wherever it led. Water is the source of life, and he believed that following it would eventually lead him to other forms of life. However, leaving this place meant he might never avenge the ants' attack. Not that Luo Wen was particularly vengeful, of course. He reassured himself it was merely a casual reflection. And so, he embarked on a long journey along the underground river. His days became a routine of eating, drinking, traveling, and resting in cycles. Occasionally, he would climb upward to search for any relatives of the white insect, but alas, he found none. He avoided returning to the surface for now. His brief experiences there had been exceedingly unpleasant. The first time, he had only suffered minor burns, but the next 2 times nearly cost him his life. As he continued along the underground river, its elevation gradually rose. The riverbed, once 50 to 60 meters below the surface, was now only about 20 meters deep. Luo Wen's body had also regrown to the size of a fingernail. Honestly, his growth was slower than he had anticipated. Besides the low energy conversion efficiency of his diet, most of his energy was expended on the heavy labor of digging. He also suspected that his oxygen supply system was a significant limiting factor in his growth. He desperately needed a new, more robust oxygen delivery mechanism to replace the current one. Time passed in unknown measure. The riverbed continued to rise, drawing nearer to the surface, while the rocky layer he traversed came to within a few meters of the ground. Soil began to mix with the rock, and the layer of sand and gravel thinned to almost nothing. Occasionally, plant roots appeared, weaving through the soil. Luo Wen sensed that he might soon leave the desert. When the rock layer was only a meter below the surface, the sand and gravel vanished entirely, leaving just soil. Plant roots grew thicker and more numerous here, indicating an abundance of vegetation above. Yet, he found no sign of white insects. Unable to resist, Luo Wen finally tunneled out of the soil to the surface for a look. His large, bulbous eyes finally proved useful, capturing the surrounding landscape with startling clarity. His field of vision extended to nearly 20 meters, seemingly having strengthened unnoticed. Clusters of unknown shrubs dotted the land, interspersed with windblown sand, now reduced to a minor component. Despite the vegetation, the area still felt barren. He saw no trace of insects or animals. It was daytime. The scorching sun beat down on Luo Wen, but instead of the searing pain he'd felt before, he found the warmth rather pleasant. His fire resistance had clearly improved. Cautiously, he crept to the nearest shrub. Its thick yellow-white trunk twisted upward, sprouting numerous slender branches adorned with countless tiny green leaves. It looked delicious. The black moss from underground had long disappeared, likely needing the deep subterranean environment to grow. Luo Wen had spent 2 days surviving on water alone before coming across scattered tree roots. The juice extracted from these roots barely sustained him, with just enough surplus to scrape by. Sticking to his plan, Luo Wen continued following the underground river. After all, seeking alternatives in such an environment carried significant risks. Gradually, the roots became more abundant, until they were omnipresent. Luo Wen no longer had to worry about food, but a new problem arose. Chapter 12. Stink Bug. The distance between the rocky layer and the surface was now less than 2 meters. This was not good news for Luo Wen. His advantage lay underground. In this unfamiliar world, among all the creatures he had encountered, he was the fastest mover underground thanks to his burrowing limbs. So far, however, he had only seen 2 types of creatures, white grubs and yellow earth ants. On the surface, his speed could only rank second. The difference between first and second was significant. The first position indicated no other creatures for comparison, while the second implied that at least one creature was faster than him. Being fast was a critical survival trait in moments of crisis. Thus, underground, his safety level was much higher than on the surface. But now, his strategic depth was less than 2 meters. What good was speed? He would reach the end as soon as he started running, and the end would be a dead end. While horizontal movement was still possible, if the enemy came in swarms, he could still be surrounded. Take the ants, for example. Their numbers were never an issue, and this left him feeling deeply insecure. Therefore, he decided to change his strategy. Given the current trend, with the subterranean water table rising, vegetation was becoming denser and more abundant. Similarly, more and more creatures would appear. If he continued blindly burrowing, he might very well dig himself into an enemy encirclement. He needed to slow down, gather more information, and plan his next steps accordingly. This location, devoid of any insects or animals besides shrubs, suited him perfectly. It was like playing a survival game. He was advancing cautiously, ensuring no enemies approached from behind. But before anything else, he had to fill his stomach. The tender green leaves on these shrubs were exceptionally fresh. After multiple thorough tests to confirm they were non-toxic, Luo Wen finally indulged himself. Judging by the abundance of these shrubs, their leaves would likely be his staple food for the foreseeable future. They were worth the effort to verify. With his belly full and the sun no longer a threat, Luo Wen wasted no time. He immediately got back to work. He had barely crawled out before suffering his first attack. Luo Wen had been highly vigilant. His compound eyes, typically well protected during digging, demonstrated extraordinary abilities. Their high resolution made the attacker unmistakable, a creature that was long and sleek, like an oversized earthworm. It suddenly shot out from the soil, its plump cylindrical body resembling a tubular sac aiming to engulf him. Its exact appearance remained unclear from Luo Wen's perspective, as all he saw was a massive mouth lined with rows upon rows of fine, sharp teeth spiraling inward, extending deep into its dark, hollow body. The sight was enough to make one's skin crawl. Thanks to the high refresh rate of his compound eyes, the giant worm's originally rapid movements seemed significantly slower, giving Luo Wen ample time to react. With a slight sidestep, he avoided the attack. Missing its target, the giant worm retracted into the soil, acting as if nothing had happened. Neither side suffered any injuries, and they should have been able to call it even. However, Luo Wen wasn't one to hold grudges, or so it seemed. He deliberately entered the worm's attack range multiple times, and each time, it sprang out to attack without fail. Thanks to the worm's cooperation, Luo Wen quickly gathered enough data. First, its intelligence was low, this was immediately apparent. Next, its body functioned like a spring. It remained compressed underground and sprang out swiftly when prey approached. However, its attack range was limited to the radius of its half-body length in front of it. Lastly, it relied on sound and subtle vibrations to locate prey. With this in mind, Luo Wen burrowed underground, approaching the worm from below. The creature's weaknesses were too glaring. The fact that it hadn't gone extinct yet was nothing short of miraculous. Although its attacks were swift due to its spring-like mechanism, it was only effective when lying in wait as a trap. Against someone like Luo Wen, who played by his own rules, it stood no chance. When Luo Wen bit into the worm from below, it had only managed to turn halfway. This was a pure display of intellectual superiority. But Luo Wen felt no sense of achievement. This creature's intelligence was unlikely to comprehend what superiority even meant. Showing off to a fool was pointless. However, he realized that if even a dimwit like this could set a trap to hunt prey, it suggested that there were even dimmer creatures nearby. Initially, Luo Wen worried that with his current equipment, he might have to lie low for a while as a vegetarian insect. Unexpectedly, a fool had jumped out to reassure him that he could continue being a carnivorous bug. The oversized worm had no exoskeletal armor. Its tough yet pliant skin was no match for Luo Wen's sharp mandibles. With just one bite, Luo Wen tore through the worm's body. Blackish-brown fluid oozed from the wound, and his suctorial mouthparts latched onto it. Blah, blah, blah. The moment the liquid entered his esophagus, Luo Wen spat repeatedly, trying to expel it. Although he managed to spit out most of it, some had already entered his stomach. A rancid mud-like stench filled his mouth. It was utterly revolting. Luo Wen considered himself a bug of simple tastes. He had even licked stones before, but this creature delivered a critical blow to his palate. This creature was likely the dumbest in the area. It probably survived by eating dirt and set traps merely to pass the time. The fact that it had lived this long without going extinct was entirely due to its disgusting taste. It perfectly embodied the principle: if I evolve to be inedible enough, no predator will bother with me. Luo Wen shook his head repeatedly, silently vowing to steer clear of it. Its flavor was so off-putting that he nearly developed an eating disorder. He resolved not to eat anything for the rest of the day. Turning his back on the worm, he quickened his pace and left, unable to stomach even the sight of it. If the worm had any useful genetic fragments, Luo Wen would have forced himself to eat it despite the gag reflex. Unfortunately, while the countless fine teeth had some appeal, its nauseating quality was something even an undiscerning bug like Luo Wen found unacceptable. Even if he could stomach it, the ability was pointless. It was the product of countless generations of self-sacrifice by the worm's ancestors, embedding their stench into the DNA of nearby predators. To illustrate, if Luo Wen had offspring, he'd definitely tell them to steer clear of these creatures. Descending into the rocky layer, Luo Wen crawled into a crevice. After drinking his fill of water and relieving himself, he finally managed to rid himself of the foul taste. Luo Wen realized he had been careless again. He still lacked sufficient experience as a bug. His antennae had taste sensors, and he resolved to taste test prey with them next time. For now, he had no energy for further exploration. He decided to rest for a while before continuing his journey. Chapter 13. Watching the show. When Luo Wen crawled back to the surface, it was already nighttime. The cool moonlight bathed the land, with a thin layer of frost on the ground reflecting a crystalline glow. Luo Wen didn't feel much of a chill. After all, he had no idea how far he'd traveled from his original location. It was possible that the nighttime temperatures here weren't as low. Or maybe his cold resistance had increased. Either way, the constant change of scenery made it difficult to draw any definitive conclusions. Two light sources still hung high in the sky. Although Luo Wen couldn't see them clearly, he could faintly discern their positions and colors. One was white with a slight yellowish hue, while the other was tinged with red. The yellow-white one appeared several times larger than the red one. The cold wind blew through the silence of the night. No insect chirps or other sounds could be heard, creating an eerie and somewhat terrifying atmosphere. With his 6 striding limbs crunching lightly on the frost, Luo Wen advanced cautiously, producing faint sounds and vibrations as he explored. The surrounding shrubs had folded their green leaves tightly against their branches, making the originally yellowish-white branches look like they were wearing green coats. Luo Wen guessed that this might be a unique adaptation for retaining warmth. Since he encountered no trouble, no giant earthworm relatives or friends, he managed to make significant progress despite his slow pace. Previously, he had stayed directly above the underground river to quickly gather food and water. But as the riverbed rose, Luo Wen shifted slightly away to maintain a sufficient strategic depth underground. Now, he was several hundred meters from the riverbed, running parallel to it. This way, he remained close enough to water while having enough soil above him for safety. On this alien planet, Luo Wen still couldn't figure out the rotational and orbital systems. The timekeeping methods from his previous world no longer applied here. He had been crawling for a long time, yet the sky remained unchanged. The sun showed no signs of starting its shift. Feeling his energy reserves drop to nearly half, Luo Wen stopped moving forward. In this unfamiliar and dangerous environment, he didn't dare exhaust his strength completely. He always stopped with about half his energy left, reserving it for potential emergencies. After munching on some food from the shrub roots, he burrowed deep underground to rest. After several days of slow advancement, the number of surface plants increased, and their variety became richer. The last time Luo Wen crawled to the surface, it was broad daylight. Not long after he started moving, he stumbled upon a dramatic scene. A massive black insect, easily over 10 times his size and roughly the size of a human palm, was surrounded by dozens of ant-like black insects. The black insect had a flat head with an exaggerated pair of giant mandibles. Its segmented body, viewed from the back, was armored with thick exoskeleton plates. Its 6 short limbs made it appear very low to the ground, and a pair of slender antennae extended from either side of its mandibles. The black ants surrounding it seemed unremarkable in appearance. They lacked the exaggerated hooks and massive mandibles of the yellow earth ants Luo Wen had previously encountered and didn't resort to fecal attacks. Their abilities, if any, were yet to be revealed. At that moment, both sides were locked in a tense standoff, with the battle on the brink of erupting. The massive black beetle strolled leisurely, seemingly indifferent to the tiny ants encircling it. The black ants, on the other hand, held their positions, as if waiting for reinforcements. It made sense. These black ants were smaller than Luo Wen, so why would they think challenging such a behemoth was a good idea? Luo Wen's advantage became evident in this situation. Although his compound eyes would have been considered nearsighted by human standards, they were essentially eagle-eyed compared to other insects. From a safe distance, he observed the confrontation without alerting either side. As long as he avoided making too much noise, they wouldn't notice him. Among insects, poor eyesight often meant that other sensory systems were highly developed. Neither side of this confrontation was something Luo Wen could afford to provoke. He had learned a painful lesson last time he tried to spectate a conflict, losing his self-made nest and being forced into exile for so long. Despite swearing back then that he would never watch another fight, Luo Wen couldn't help himself when presented with the opportunity. Fine, so he'd be a dog for watching. Dogs were far stronger than this fingernail-sized bug he'd become. Still, he had learned one thing. Don't get too close while spectating. Watch from a safe distance to avoid getting dragged into the fray. The ants gradually tightened their encirclement, agitating the black beetle. It lost its calm demeanor, brandishing its massive mandibles in preparation for an attack. The tension reached a breaking point. Unable to endure any longer, the black beetle charged forward, snapping its mandibles around one of the black ants. In an instant, the ant was decapitated. Its body fell to the ground in 2 pieces. Even after its head and torso separated, its antennae and limb segments twitched reflexively. The opening move was swift and deadly, clean and decisive. Luo Wen felt his blood pumping and couldn't help but cheer internally. The death of one of their kind enraged the black ants, prompting them to launch a full-scale assault. The battle quickly turned fierce. Although the black ants had overwhelming numbers, their slender limbs and small bodies gave them few advantages. Only their sharp mandibles were noteworthy, but these were of little use against the heavily armored beetle. The black beetle, on the other hand, resembled an unstoppable war machine. Its massive mandibles were unstoppable. Anything caught in their grip had no chance of survival. Leaving behind an intact corpse was a rarity. However, its mandibles had a design flaw. Like 2 interlocking sevens, they could only deliver their devastating bite at the tips. The ant's small size and agile movements made it difficult for the beetle to land precise attacks. As a result, while its attacks were lethal, the fight remained evenly matched. Still, the occasional unlucky ant would fall victim, leaving scattered body parts around the battlefield. Despite their numerical advantage, the ants were slowly losing ground. Without reinforcements, their complete defeat was only a matter of time. Realizing this, the ants changed their tactics. Instead of gnawing futilely on the beetle's thick carapace, the ants climbed its back to target its eyes and antennae, key vulnerabilities that could render it blind and deaf. Meanwhile, the ants on the ground focused their attacks on the beetle's clawed limbs. Though its heavy armor protected most of its joints, the exposed claw tips became the primary targets. The tactical shift was immediately effective. The beetle's once dominant assault became restrained and defensive. It now devoted most of its energy to shaking off ants from its back and dodging attacks at its feet. Watching from a distance, Luo Wen cursed the ants for their dishonorable, underhanded tactics. Chapter 14. Picking up the scraps. The ants intertwined their bodies, forming a net that entangled the black beetle. The beetle struggled more and more to shake off the ants, and the tide of battle shifted from a one-sided massacre to an uncertain outcome. If there had been bets placed, this would surely go down as a tragic spectacle. After losing 2 claw tips and half an antenna, the black beetle finally chose to retreat. Continuing the fight would likely lead to its death, but if it decided to flee, the ant's slender frames couldn't stop it. Like a heavy tank crashing through infantry lines, the black beetle charged away with ants clinging to its body, scattering some along the way due to sheer speed. Since Luo Wen had been observing from a great distance, the beetle quickly disappeared beyond his sight, ants still riding on it. Luo Wen didn't linger idly. Why had he been watching all this time? Besides the entertainment, he harbored the hope of scavenging something useful from the battlefield. Now that both sides had left, the area was littered with loot. Passing up such an opportunity wasn't Luo Wen's style. He scrambled up and quickly scuttled toward the battlefield. Though it was only a dozen meters away, a mere few steps for his human-sized self, it was a marathon for his fingernail-sized body. Fortunately, Luo Wen had anticipated scavenging from the start. While spectating, he had planned his route to the battlefield and checked for potential dangers along the way. Nothing seemed amiss on the surface, but the hidden ambush tactics of the dim-witted earthworm earlier taught him to be cautious. Predators employing stealthy hunting methods were hard to spot until it was too late. So, as he raced forward, Luo Wen kept an eye on the ground beneath him to avoid a tragic mishap. Luckily, he reached the battlefield safely. His suctorial mouth wasn't suited for quickly consuming meat, so he grabbed a piece of an ant's lower body, raised his rear, and burrowed underground. After digging a small hole deep below to store the food, Luo Wen returned twice more, retrieving a severed head and a torso. But when he emerged a third time, a few ants were already beginning to return to the battlefield. Not wanting to risk it, he retreated to the underground. Carrying the ant remnants, Luo Wen burrowed deeper, creating a small chamber and carving out several escape routes. He also gathered some roots for extra sustenance. Once everything was set, he finally began his meal, hoping for some useful gains. It took him a long time to thoroughly lick the ant meat clean, leaving behind a pile of discarded exoskeleton shells. Luo Wen set them aside and went to rest with high expectations. When he awoke, he ignored his hunger and the low-energy alerts from his reserves, rushing to examine his body. He inspected his antennae, eyes, limbs, and carapace. None showed any changes. Disappointed, Luo Wen recalled that the black ants hadn't displayed any special abilities during the fight. He shouldn't have hoped for too much. He pouted in frustration, then noticed something unusual about his mouth. Was something different? Unfortunately, his mouth was one of the blind spots in his compound eye's field of vision. Carefully, he used a limb to probe and feel with its fine bristles. ANO circumflex es. Oh, if only he had a mirror, this wouldn't be such a hassle. Suddenly, inspiration struck. His mouth must have changed because of the black ants. It was likely similar to their mouths. The empty ant head was still lying nearby. Luo Wen approached it for a closer look. Comparing the sensations from his bristles with the specimen in front of him, Luo Wen reached a conclusion. My mouth finally got an upgrade. He exclaimed. Luo Wen had long harbored a grudge against his previous suctorial mouth. Why couldn't he have been given something more capable at the start? Instead, he had been stuck with a mouth made for soft foods, a freeloader's mouth, as he called it. Now, his new mouth resembled the black ant's chewing-type mouthparts. The mushroom-like shape of his original mouth was gone, replaced by structures like multiple lip plates, mandibles, labial palps, and sclerites. These components could shovel food into his mouth as if a ring of tiny hands had grown around it. Quite the mental image. Though chewing mouthparts were the most basic type for insects, with suctorial mouthparts being an evolution from them, this wasn't necessarily a regression. Sometimes, the simplest tools were the most versatile, and what suited him best was what mattered. It was a bright and sunny day. The familiar shrubs had unfolded their green leaves. With the underground river rising closer to the surface, vegetation grew denser, covering the ground with rotting leaves rather than yellow sand. Luo Wen crawled through the underground for some time, putting distance between himself and the battlefield above. Finally, he pushed aside a layer of fallen leaves and emerged. The chirps of unseen insects filled the shrubs. Compared to the desolate desert, this area felt far livelier. Of course, this also meant greater danger. After crawling a short distance, Luo Wen's antennae picked up some unusual sounds from a shrub nearby. Turning to look, he saw what appeared to be a relative of yesterday's war god, beetle munching on leaves. The sounds were coming from it. This black beetle was even larger than the one from yesterday and had intact limbs. That was how Luo Wen immediately knew it wasn't the same beetle. But to his surprise, this mighty warrior, a juggernaut capable of taking on multiple enemies, was a vegetarian. Luo Wen was stunned. It was like seeing a heavily armored knight wielding a massive sword, drenched in blood after slaying foes, return to cheers only to grin and say, "Actually, I'm just cosplaying." Luo Wen felt a wave of dismay. As a self-identified carnivorous insect, being utterly outclassed in size and equipment by a plant-eater left him in a bad mood. Before he could vent his frustration, he noticed movement near the beetle. A piece of bark seemed to shift. Focusing intently, Luo Wen saw a pair of slender antennae twitching at the edge of the bark. It wasn't bark at all, it was an insect. Still recovering from the shock of the vegetarian revelation, Luo Wen was stunned again. Was this some kind of camouflage tech? What was this bug's deal? His knowledge of entomology was clearly lacking. He'd heard of chameleons but never of shape-shifting bugs. The camouflage had some minor flaws, but without movement, it was nearly undetectable. As the wind rustled the leaves and branches, producing soft noises, the disguised insect crept closer to the oblivious beetle under the cover of sound. After a few minutes, it was just a step away from the beetle's rear. The black beetle remained unaware, but Luo Wen, watching from afar, felt his heart tighten. What was this camouflaged bug planning? Chapter 15. Take the risk. Under Luo Wen's ultra-high-resolution compound eyes, the camouflage bug had already revealed its true form. Somehow, it had strapped a piece of bark to its back that didn't fall off. Its actual body was a slender, wingless insect resembling a mosquito magnified dozens of times. What was this weakling, with barely any exoskeletal armor, trying to do? Was it planning to challenge the war god, one-on-one? That was pure suicide. Luo Wen couldn't help but ridicule, forgetting that he had once been an equally defenseless creature with an unprotected abdomen. Suddenly, the camouflage bug, now behind the black beetle, extended its coiled mouthpart. The organ straightened to a length nearly equal to its entire body, resembling a steel needle. The steel-like needle slipped slowly into the crevice between the black beetle's shoulder plate and back armor. Yet the beetle remained completely unresponsive. Moments later, the camouflage bug's thin, shriveled abdomen began to swell. The black beetle, though outwardly unchanged, gradually stopped chewing on leaves. This world is insanely dangerous. Luo Wen cursed internally. The black beetle had been the most imposing and majestic bug Luo Wen had encountered so far. Just yesterday, it had shown off its prowess by taking on multiple opponents single-handedly. Yet today, it was effortlessly taken out by a sneaky assassin. This shattered Luo Wen's perception of strength. He had quietly set the black beetle as his next evolution goal. Its sheer size, dozens of times larger than his own, was intimidating enough. But now, this imposing beetle was slain by a sneaky camouflage bug. If anything, this suggested that strength was relative. Luo Wen figured that had the black beetle spotted its assailant earlier, it would have crushed the camouflage bug easily. The outcome of their encounter had depended entirely on the element of surprise. So, what did it mean to be strong? Luo Wen pondered this question. Even if he could someday kill a black beetle, what would stop another bug from emerging to counter him? He thought of a movie from his human days about a superhero with an indestructible body, laser vision, freezing breath, supersonic speed, telescopic sight, and super hearing. Even that being had a weapon capable of neutralizing it. Honestly, Luo Wen felt a bit lost. Would the evolution of an individual ever have an endpoint? And even if there were one, could an individual's strength alone reach it? After some thought, Luo Wen dismissed the idea. He was just a bug the size of a fingernail. Worrying about such things was ridiculous. Survival came first. The camouflage bug, its needle-like mouthpart now soft and coiled, perched motionlessly on the bark again, its massively swollen belly rendering its camouflage ineffective. After careful observation and calculations, Luo Wen decided to take a gamble. The camouflage bug's only real threat was its mouthpart. While its size was much larger, Luo Wen believed he had an 80% chance of victory with caution. If things went south, its bloated body would likely hinder it enough for him to escape. Luo Wen couldn't account for every possible variable, nor could he plan a flawless strategy. But 80% was good enough for him to make his move. Time was life. Having made up his mind, he didn't hesitate. He darted toward the camouflage bug, which, overly confident in its disguise, remained still as Luo Wen approached. Taking advantage of its complacency, Luo Wen scurried under the bark it used as a shield. Bracing himself with his middle and rear legs, he lunged forward, sinking his jaws into the bug's neck. Luo Wen had no weapons besides his two mandibles. Against the much larger camouflage bug, his bite wouldn't threaten most parts of its body. But the thin neck was an exception. Catching the camouflage bug off guard, Luo Wen seized the opportunity. His attack landed on the most critical spot. Panicked, the camouflage bug flailed its long, spindly limbs wildly, sending both of them tumbling off the tree trunk. They wrestled on the rotting, foul-smelling ground. The camouflage bug repeatedly extended and retracted its mouthpart, aiming to pierce Luo Wen. Luo Wen wasn't about to make things easy. Every claw on his body clung tightly to the bug, keeping him locked onto its neck. No matter how the bug twisted and turned, Luo Wen held firm, immovable. Due to Luo Wen's small size and his position, the camouflage bug's attacks missed their mark repeatedly. Gradually, the connection between its head and body grew weaker. Its head drooped, and its struggles ceased, though its body twitched reflexively. Luo Wen held his position for a while longer, only releasing when he was sure the camouflage bug was dead. A gamble well taken. Now, it was time to reap the rewards. Before feasting, Luo Wen climbed back up the tree to check on the black beetle. As he suspected, while its claws still clung to the branch, its insides were hollow, its muscles and organs liquefied and drained by the camouflage bug. Satisfied that the beetle was truly dead, Luo Wen returned to the camouflage bug's corpse. Despite its large size, most of its body consisted of its elongated, shriveled frame. Without its swollen abdomen, it probably had less meat than a white grub. The bark on its back accounted for much of its apparent size. It had adhered so tightly that even their violent battle hadn't dislodged it. Clearly, the camouflage bug was a seasoned ambusher. Initially, Luo Wen had thought it might possess a chameleon-like camouflage ability. Instead, it relied entirely on external tools. Poor bugs evolve. Rich bugs use gear, Luo Wen joked to himself. Could this bug be an aristocrat among insects? While amusing, the thought reminded Luo Wen that some bugs were highly intelligent. Humanity had risen to dominance on Earth through tool use. He couldn't afford to underestimate other species just because of encounters with dim-witted creatures like the stink bug. After devouring the camouflage bug's flesh, it was time for the main course. As a former human, Luo Wen found the thought of eating the bug's swollen abdomen revolting. But pickiness wasn't an option. What was normal food for insects had to become normal for him. Though he understood this logically, actually doing it was another matter. His jaws opened and closed hesitantly, unable to commit. Chapter 16. New changes. The environment here was complex and riddled with danger, leaving Luo Wen no time to adjust his mindset leisurely. He stopped hesitating, convincing himself that it was just like drinking bubble tea. With his eyes closed, he used his twin mandibles to bite a small opening into the camouflage bug's swollen belly. Thick liquid began to ooze from the wound. His newly adapted chewing mouthparts sealed over the opening, and his mandibular lobes opened and closed, sucking up every drop of the liquid. Once past the psychological barrier, Luo Wen found that, to a bug's palate, the taste was actually quite pleasant. After all, it was essentially a distillation of the black beetle's muscles, concentrated into a rich broth. It was akin to a chicken soup that had simmered for 3 days, packed with all the essence. Unfortunately, Luo Wen had recently replaced his siphoning mouthparts, which would have been ideal as a straw. Now, it felt more like drinking from a packet of juice, biting a small hole in the corner and slowly draining the contents. Occasionally, small chunks, like pearls, grass jelly, or fruit bits in bubble tea, would slip through, providing a chewy delight. He hoped this analogy would help readers enjoy their bubble tea more effectively. As the camouflage bug's swollen belly deflated, Luo Wen's digestive system went into overdrive, accelerating the processing of the liquid. Although this consumed additional energy, the relative sizes of Luo Wen and the camouflage bug made it more efficient to digest the food immediately than risk wasting it. Even with the accelerated digestion, Luo Wen felt overstuffed. This feast contained the essence of both the black beetle and the camouflage bug. While the camouflage bug didn't have much meat, the black beetle's muscle mass, even without its shell, was several times greater than Luo Wen's body. By the time he finished, Luo Wen could barely walk straight. His bloated abdomen dragged on the ground, forcing him to prop himself up with his legs to move, making his gait extremely awkward. This state left him vulnerable. His already limited speed on the surface was now even worse. Luo Wen couldn't risk becoming another bug's easy prey, so he quickly raised his rear and started digging. Only deep underground could he feel secure. This time, he dug a tunnel larger than usual to avoid compressing his swollen abdomen. His head down, legs up digging posture caused his mouthparts to clamp shut, giving him an appearance akin to wearing a faceplate. Strangely, it made him look a bit more distinguished. Reaching a safe depth, Luo Wen hastily dug out a small chamber. Without bothering to carve escape routes, he fell into a deep sleep. In his dreams, Luo Wen alternated between two identities. In one, he was a towering black war god, invincible against swarms of ants. In the other, he was a sly assassin, cloaked in tools and trickery, dispatching formidable bugs with lethal precision. Deep underground, where few insects could reach, a tiny black bug rested in its hollowed-out chamber. Its body was undergoing a transformation. Time passed. How long? Luo Wen couldn't tell. When he finally woke, he was momentarily dazed. It took only a moment to regain his bearings, and he immediately began examining his body. His oversized digging limbs were ill-suited for delicate work, so his second pair of thoracic limbs acted as hands. Their bristled surfaces carefully explored every inch of his body. From top to bottom, he started with his compound eyes, no changes. His chewing mouthparts remained intact, and his digging limbs showed no abnormalities. The number of legs was correct, neither more nor less. A 360-degree scan with his compound eyes revealed no changes to his shoulder plates or back armor. Even his size remained the same, still about the size of a fingernail. Then he felt something odd around his abdomen. Twisting his body, he managed to catch sight of it. Did I just take a short nap? His abdomen was still swollen and round. Luo Wen, momentarily perplexed, thought the food might not have fully digested. But soon, he noticed something unusual. His abdomen hadn't shrunk. In fact, it had grown larger and longer. What the hell is this thing growing out of me? Luo Wen couldn't help but curse. He had hoped that absorbing the black beetle's essence, even secondhand, might enhance his size or strengthen his exoskeleton. If not, he would have settled for the camouflage bug's bark-adhering ability. At the very least, gaining its needle-like mouthpart would have been acceptable. But now his abdomen had grown wider and longer. Was he so overstuffed that he'd ruined his stomach? For a while, Luo Wen was utterly baffled. Trying to walk around, he found the new appendage severely hindered his speed and agility. It gave him an awkward, off-balance feeling. Not wanting to take any chances, he flipped onto his back and arched his upper body like doing a sit-up to inspect the situation. When he saw it, Luo Wen swore under his breath. It wasn't his abdomen that had enlarged. It was a new growth attached to his rear. Previously, Luo Wen's body followed the standard insect structure: head, thorax, and abdomen. Now, there was a fourth section. His original abdomen had 9 segments, though 3 had been lost in a fight with the yellow earth ants. While the wound had healed, the segments had never regenerated. Now, the remaining 6 segments seemed compressed, as if a spring had been compacted, leaving a smaller abdomen. The newly grown section resembled a swollen version of the original abdomen, complete with segmented rings, which had fooled Luo Wen into thinking it was part of his stomach. This appendage dragged behind him like a trailer, severely limiting his maneuverability. Only upon closer inspection did Luo Wen realize it wasn't his abdomen's fault, it was this new addition causing the problem. What now? Luo Wen muttered. He was already at the lower end of the insect food chain, and now he had an unwieldy burden. Unless he could secure a steady food source like the white grubs, the risk of foraging would skyrocket. After the initial panic, Luo Wen gradually calmed down. Reflecting on his prior evolutions, he realized that every new organ or ability had a purpose. If he could uncover some clues, he might understand this transformation. He recalled how his compound eyes had improved to eliminate nearsightedness, granting him a wider field of view. Later, he had grown digging limbs to enhance his burrowing speed. His mandibles had developed to chew through roots and prey, and his back armor had thickened after losing a fight with the yellow earth ants. Eating the white grub had triggered cocooning for recovery. His most recent change had replaced his siphoning mouthparts with chewing ones. Logically, absorbing the black beetle and camouflage bug's genes should have granted him some of their traits. Even if he didn't inherit the beetle's size or armor, he should have gained something from the camouflage bug. Yet now, after digesting the food and expending so much energy, he had grown an unrelated appendage. Why? Chapter 17. Reflections. Luo Wen reviewed his brief insect life in detail. Thankfully, his experiences weren't extensive. He could recall everything from birth to now in just a short time. Could it be that some dormant genes in his body had been activated? Like his digging limbs. That wasn't impossible. But what was this new appendage good for? The inability to consciously choose which genetic fragments to activate was indeed frustrating. Now he was stuck with something that gave him a headache. At this moment, Luo Wen yearned to grow up and reach maturity, but that was impossible without significant time and energy. Reflecting on his experiences, Luo Wen realized the variety of bugs and food he'd encountered was pitifully small. Root sap, white grubs, black moss, ants, black beetles, and camouflage bugs. Wait, ants. His thoughts paused, rewinding to a potential clue, the ants. He also remembered tasting a bit of that foul-smelling earthworm. Although he spat most of it out, who knew if he might have absorbed some strange genetic fragment from it. But no, the earthworm didn't have anything resembling this appendage, and they were clearly different species. He dismissed the possibility. As for the ants, they didn't have anything like this either. The trail went cold again. Luo Wen refused to believe this oversized rear had appeared for no reason. There had to be a clue somewhere. He recalled that every evolution gave him something he desperately needed. Did he need a giant rear end right now? That was absurd. Suddenly, Luo Wen thought back to the day he witnessed the camouflage bug stealthily kill the black beetle. That had prompted him to ponder a philosophical question for a long time. Could that be the source of his problem? Could an individual alone ever reach the ultimate pinnacle of strength, one that transcends all limitations? On the journey toward such strength, vulnerabilities would always exist, exploitable by various means. So before reaching that ultimate state, did one need the power of a collective? Those questions had left him dizzy back then, and he hadn't arrived at an answer. But if he followed that line of thought further, he came to a terrifying conclusion. Deep down, Luo Wen's subconscious seemed to have answered the question, the power of a collective. Yet here he was, a solitary bug, without even a glimpse of his kind. Where could he possibly find a collective? And so, the answer became clear. But Luo Wen didn't want to accept it. This wasn't the path he wanted. Looking back, it seemed his predecessors had all pursued the path of individual might. He, on the other hand, had no guidance, no teachings, just trial and error. It was no wonder he'd gone astray. Since his predecessors hadn't ventured down this path, there wouldn't be any genetic fragments left behind for it. That meant the problem lay entirely with him. He realized the most likely culprit was the ants. During his encounters with them, he had first picked up the nearest body, then a head on the second trip, and finally, the largest one on his third and final attempt. Could that have been a queen ant's body? Luo Wen wasn't sure, but he knew queens were usually hidden deep within the nest and rarely ventured out. However, he had heard that ants carried dormant queen ant genes. When a queen died, and the suppressive pheromones were no longer present, some ants could transform into new queens. Alternatively, it might have been a queen that had left the colony with her followers, only to be bisected by the black beetle, war god. That could explain why the ants had launched a suicidal frenzy to avenge her. This scenario was dramatic enough to be a novel plot. Still, that was how ants behaved back on Earth. Who knew what these local ants were like? Speculating further yielded no definitive answers. And even if he figured it out, the reality remained. It was too late to change anything. Deep down, Luo Wen had chosen the power of a collective. His body, ever so considerate, had solved his problem of being a solitary bug. By giving him a reproductive organ to create his own companions. What Luo Wen truly rejected wasn't the idea of collective power. Honestly, he had grown tired of his cautious, perilous existence and wouldn't mind having a few companions to keep watch for danger. But he couldn't accept the method. Didn't this mean he had become a female bug? This was a blow to his masculine pride, and he refused to compromise. Yet what could he do? The deed was done. Luo Wen felt utterly baffled. The mental effort of grappling with these questions left his head aching. Intellectual work seemed to consume a lot of energy, and he had only just woken up, so he needed to replenish himself. Let's find some food first. Thinking requires energy, Luo Wen muttered. Although he resolved to think after eating, controlling his thoughts was easier said than done. The more he tried not to think, the more his mind wandered. As he dug, Luo Wen's thoughts kept circling. If he were in his mature stage, this would be easy to solve. He could simply regress the organ. But as a juvenile, he lacked that ability. Still, the successful replacement of his siphoning mouthparts with chewing ones gave him hope. Back then, he had loathed his mushroom-like siphoning mouthparts. When new genetic fragments became available, they were immediately replaced. Now, if he rejected the reproductive organ strongly enough, could it regress back to its original state? With a clear plan and goal in mind, Luo Wen's eyes brightened, and he dug with renewed vigor. He avoided the surface. In his current bloated, clumsy state, going above ground would be a death sentence, inviting predators to pounce. Instead, he scavenged some plant roots underground. With his shrunken stomach, he didn't need much food. After quickly filling up, he returned to his makeshift burrow. Still wide awake after his recent sleep, Luo Wen lay on the ground, unable to doze off. He wondered whether the evolution process required sleep to trigger. Could it not activate while he was awake? His mind spun with questions. As the saying goes, true wisdom is concise, while ignorance fills volumes. With a mountain of questions needing answers, Luo Wen lamented that if someone could offer even a shred of guidance, he wouldn't have ended up in this mess, where even his gender had been changed. Bored and unable to sleep, he decided to study the new organ. If it couldn't be regressed, he at least needed to understand it. Truth be told, Luo Wen was curious. Curiosity is the driving force of development. For a girl, it's the first step toward liking a boy. For a bug, curiosity about a new organ might lead to surprising discoveries. Driven by this curiosity, Luo Wen lightly probed the organ. It was attached to the end of his abdomen. There was a small opening there, which he had previously assumed was an excretory hole. However, he'd lost the final 3 abdominal segments in a fight, and the hole had disappeared when the wound healed. Now, the hole had inexplicably reappeared, though Luo Wen had only ever expelled water from a hidden opening in the middle of his abdomen. He had never used the one at the rear and had no idea what it was for. Chapter 18. The birth of the brood nest, the beginning of the swarm. Luo Wen finally understood the purpose of the small aperture at the rear of his body after a new addition, a massive organ, had connected to it. Through this aperture, Luo Wen could transfer food to the newly formed organ. His abdomen, now compressed like a dense biscuit, could store significantly less food. Most of what he consumed was now transported directly to the new organ, where it was converted into energy. As for what the organ would do with this energy, Luo Wen dared not experiment to find out. He feared the worst. What if it produced an egg? That would be catastrophic. For now, he decided to feign ignorance, leaving room to reverse the situation later. But should his curiosity lead him to confirm his suspicions, the consequences would be unacceptable. Lost in these chaotic thoughts, time passed quickly, and Luo Wen drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, he saw the massive organ behind him open at the end, spewing out tiny insects with a poof, poof sound. Luo Wen, oddly enough, watched them with a benevolent smile. The nightmare was so chilling that it jolted him awake as if drenched in ice water. His whole body froze in terror. If such a thing ever occurred, he'd rather die than live with the shame. It took a long while for him to recover, but his body still felt incredibly drained, a sign of energy depletion. Rather than panic, Luo Wen was overjoyed. This exhaustion meant his body was undergoing another transformation. He checked his head, thorax, and back. No changes. His body size also remained the same. Breathing a sigh of relief, he noted that none of the energy had been wasted on any unwanted mutations. He then turned his attention to his abdomen, where he noticed it had returned to its normal state, no longer compressed. However, to his frustration and anger, the massive organ was still attached to his rear. His mind filled with confusion. Was this some kind of joke? All it had done was restore his abdomen while leaving his body even longer and more cumbersome. What purpose did this serve other than making him an easier target? But then he noticed something peculiar. With a thought, the new organ detached from his body and became a separate entity on the ground. He then repositioned himself, aligning the aperture on his rear with the opening on the organ. With a soft click, the organ reconnected to his body. Luo Wen was dumbfounded, marveling at the ingenuity of evolution. To prevent him from harboring self-destructive thoughts, his body had developed a compromise, turning this organ into a detachable device. All Luo Wen could do was exclaim, "Amazing." From then on, the organ could function like a machine. In emergencies, he could even drag it behind him like a cart. This ingenious design saved his dignity. No matter what others might think, Luo Wen convinced himself of this explanation and repeatedly hypnotized himself to believe it without question. With the critical issue of dignity resolved, his curiosity about the organ's function surged. He eagerly began examining it. After some exploration, Luo Wen discovered the following. It was still a living entity and required constant energy to survive. It had its own digestive and energy conversion systems. It could be fed by either connecting it to his aperture or placing food directly into a funnel-shaped opening on its side. Luo Wen decided to forget about the first feeding method. From now on, there was only one way to provide it with food. The organ had no independent consciousness. It was entirely under Luo Wen's control, and his will dictated its actions. This was logical, considering it originated from his body. Luo Wen vowed to keep this fact a strict secret. No matter which part of his body, his head, limbs, or even his rear, touched the organ, he could activate its functions. As Luo Wen had guessed, its primary function was to produce small insects. The organ shared all of Luo Wen's genetic material except his evolutionary abilities. It could mix and match his genetic fragments to produce various types of insects. This feature offered an unexpected benefit. Luo Wen now had an indirect way to view the genetic material within his body. For example, he discovered that he had indeed acquired genetic fragments from the black beetle, a pleasant surprise. However, the organ lacked the ability to hunt for its own food. Luo Wen would have to provide all its energy. Even so, Luo Wen couldn't help but exclaim, "Incredible." Before long, Luo Wen would no longer be alone. He would have his own little brothers. But he couldn't keep calling it the organ. That would reveal too much. It needed a proper name. After some thought, Luo Wen decided to call it Brood Nest, a fitting name. With the name settled, the next step was to test its capabilities. Luo Wen was eager to begin, but his empty stomach forced him to gather food first. Leaving the brood nest alone in the cave made him uneasy. It had no offensive or defensive capabilities. If something wandered in and took a bite out of it, he wouldn't even know where to cry. Reluctantly, Luo Wen reconnected the brood nest to his body and dragged it along as he ventured out. He followed the previous path he had excavated. Although the tunnel had partially collapsed, it was still more convenient than digging a new one. Reaching the roots of an unknown plant, Luo Wen began replenishing his own energy. Once sated, he turned his attention to feeding the brood nest. There was an efficient, straightforward way to do so, but Luo Wen refused to entertain it. Instead, he bit into the plant roots, sucked out some juice, and spat it into the brood nest's funnel. The process was awkward, to say the least. This method was painfully inefficient. After a long time, the brood nest had barely gathered any energy, while Luo Wen was utterly exhausted. Throughout the process, Luo Wen repeatedly checked the brood nest to see if enough material had been stored to produce an insect. His initial design was a small insect based on himself, augmented with the black beetle's powerful genes. The black beetle's oxygen supply system was only slightly more advanced than Luo Wen's, but its muscular system was much more robust, allowing it to distribute oxygen across its massive body. After some thought, Luo Wen decided to create an enhanced version of the black beetle instead. Unfortunately, the energy required to produce such a creature was astronomical. Moreover, the juice from the plant roots was highly inefficient for energy conversion. At Luo Wen's current pace, it would take an eternity to gather enough energy. This was far from the ideal scenario Luo Wen had envisioned. If this continued, the brood nest would be more of a burden than an asset to his growth. Chapter 19. The First Hatching. Luo Wen had envisioned a grand scene, standing before his enemies and shouting, "The sacred F2 binds us, swarm, charge." TN. F2 is a reference to the game StarCraft where the F2 button is the select all army button, which is especially helpful for Zerg players. Then, an endless tide of insects would flood forth, engulfing the enemy like a rolling dust storm. However, for now, this vision remained purely in his imagination. Judging by the current situation, he wasn't even sure it would ever come to fruition. Frustrated and weary from feeding the brood nest, Luo Wen bit off a small section of the tree root, carried it back with the brood nest connected to him, and returned to the underground cave. Back at the cave, He stuffed one end of the root into the funnel-shaped intake of the brood nest. The root was long, and much of it stuck out, but Luo Wen decided to leave it that way and let the brood nest digest it slowly. He patted himself on the back for his cleverness. Although this method slowed the brood nest's absorption efficiency, it saved him a great deal of effort, didn't it? Over the next few days, Luo Wen stayed put, planning to establish a temporary nest here. He expanded the small makeshift underground chamber several times over, digging dozens of tunnels that branched in all directions, some leading to the surface, others to unknown areas, and even a few descending deeper underground. He also carved out small chambers at various points in the tunnels, though they weren't immediately useful. Some tunnels ended in dead ends, purely as decoys. Several of the tunnels were especially spacious, designed as emergency escape routes for transporting the brood nest. These routes featured numerous branches to add to their complexity. Whenever he got hungry, Luo Wen brought the brood nest to the surface to drink sap from the tree roots. He would also bite off segments of root for the brood nest to absorb later. When he got tired, he simply lay down next to the brood nest and slept. After one such rest, Luo Wen woke to discover he had gained a new ability. He could secrete a sticky substance from his mouth. This secretion could be used to bind soil together, making it sturdier. As this evolution's way of telling me to never leave the ground. So many abilities tailored for burrowing and hiding. Luo Wen grumbled. Still, an ability was an ability. Using the brood nest to analyze it, Luo Wen discovered it came from genetic fragments of the black ant, which was apparently a master burrower. Despite his complaints, Luo Wen enthusiastically used his new ability to reinforce the room housing the brood nest, making it sturdier, though the process left his mouth dry. Over the next few days, the now detached brood nest grew noticeably larger. Luo Wen began to suspect it was siphoning off the energy meant for producing insects to fuel its own growth. The brood nest had grown so large that Luo Wen now struggled to move it. If this continued, his wide escape tunnels would become useless. Upon investigating, Luo Wen realized the problem was his own doing. The first insect he had designed was based on the black beetle, war god. Luo Wen had further enhanced it by adding digging appendages and replacing its short antennae with longer ones for better sensory capabilities, reducing the risk of ambush. However, this design drastically increased the material and energy requirements. The real issue was that the war god was over 10 times Luo Wen's size. For the brood nest to hatch such a creature, it first needed to grow even larger than the war god itself. Upon realizing this, Luo Wen cursed the rigid operating system of the brood nest. Couldn't it be more flexible? All the energy he'd painstakingly gathered had gone into its unnecessary growth. But the brood nest, being a mechanical-like production factory, showed no signs of appeasing its creator. It silently conveyed its indifference. If you don't want to keep me, just leave me here to fend for myself. Go ahead, I dare you. In the end, Luo Wen caved. Abandoning the brood nest was not an option. He quickly revised his orders, instructing the brood nest to hatch a scaled-down version of the war god instead. Meanwhile, Luo Wen took the opportunity to survey the surrounding area while digging tunnels. He found no immediate threats, so he grew less vigilant about constantly dragging the brood nest around. Besides, its increasing size made that impractical. He dug a hidden chamber adjacent to the large room housing the brood nest, leaving only a small entryway that he could barely fit through. Luo Wen crafted a makeshift door using his sticky saliva and sealed the entrance every time he left. After a few tries, his technique improved to the point where the door fit seamlessly, leaving no visible traces from the outside. Luo Wen reflected on his apparent talent for anything related to digging. The brood nest's increased size wasn't entirely a downside. It could now chew through tree roots faster and convert energy more efficiently. Luo Wen hesitated. Would making the brood nest even larger be beneficial? But if it grew any bigger, he'd lose the ability to move it entirely. For now, the current size was sufficient. Luo Wen decided to focus on hatching a few insects to see their effectiveness before making further plans. 2 days later, the brood nest finally accumulated enough energy to begin hatching its first insect. The hatching process took an astonishing amount of time. After another 2 days, the brood nest spat out a black beetle-like insect, exactly as Luo Wen had envisioned. Or perhaps, sprayed would be a more fitting term. One side of the brood nest split open, and the insect emerged amidst a torrent of viscous fluid, splattering onto the ground. Fortunately, Luo Wen had anticipated this and widened the room's entrance. Otherwise, the newly hatched beetle would have slammed against the wall. After ejecting the insect, the brood nest rapidly deflated, resembling a punctured balloon. Luo Wen panicked. Is this thing a one-time use? He muttered anxiously. A quick inspection revealed that while the brood nest wasn't permanently damaged, the process of hatching the black beetle had drained it severely. It would need significant time and energy to recover. Even the brood nest has to go on maternity leave. Luo Wen sighed in frustration. 2 days to gather energy, 2 days to hatch, and then an extended recovery period. At this rate, when would he ever amass the insect army of his dreams? Was this what the power of the collective was supposed to mean? It felt more like a trial designed to exhaust him to death on his way to ultimate evolution. Despite his disappointment, Luo Wen suppressed his frustration and turned his attention to the newly hatched black beetle. He could only hope it wouldn't let him down. Chapter 20. Flaws. The black beetle, still lying in a pool of viscous fluid, struggled to its feet. It was slightly larger than Luo Wen, modeled after the war god beetle. With a pair of massive mandibles, extended antennae for better signal reception, and an additional pair of digging limbs, it now boasted 4 pairs of legs instead of 3. Looking at the creature before him, Luo Wen couldn't help but marvel at the wonder of evolution. His frustration began to ease. In his previous life, even with humanity's advanced technology, creating a living creature like this, combining various insect organs seamlessly, would have been impossible. Unless, of course, you glued together pieces of dead insects. But this one was alive. And judging by its movements, all its newly added organs worked flawlessly without any signs of incompatibility. However, as Luo Wen observed the beetle, he realized something awkward. He couldn't communicate with it. This revelation was both shocking and frustrating. Who would have thought that after all the effort, after nearly wrecking the brood nest, he'd end up with a creature that couldn't even understand him? Luo Wen wondered if insect communication was required, but he had never learned any insect language. Luckily, while the beetle couldn't communicate, it also didn't attack him. Perhaps this was because its original form, the war god, was herbivorous. Then again, it seemed unlikely. Even as a herbivore, the war god was known for its violent temperament. Luo Wen hadn't given it the nickname lightly. It had earned it in countless direct confrontations, proving itself the strongest combatant he had encountered among insects. If the beetle was hostile, Luo Wen would already be in trouble. Instead, the situation suggested the brood nest had programmed the beetle with a built-in friend or foe recognition system. But why was the communication system malfunctioning? Luo Wen thought carefully. The brood nest had evolved from fragments of queen ant genes. This was no longer just speculation. He had confirmed it by examining the brood nest's genetic library. Some of these gene fragments had likely come from black ants, though Luo Wen couldn't be sure. Ant colonies operated with impeccable coordination, implying they had some form of communication. If Luo Wen's queen ant genes originated from black ants, perhaps he also inherited the genes responsible for their communication system. With this in mind, Luo Wen quickly examined the brood nest. Thanks to its indirect access to his genetic library, he could investigate this issue more thoroughly. Fortunately, there weren't many gene fragments in his library, a bittersweet fact. While it highlighted how limited his genetic resources were, it also saved Luo Wen a lot of time. Among the black ant gene fragments, there were 3 notable ones. Queen ant genes, which influenced the development of the brood nest. A gene related to the secretion of formic acid, linked to his recently acquired, sticky saliva, ability. A gene that allowed the secretion of pheromones, though its function was still unclear. Luo Wen hypothesized that formic acid, while useful for construction, was unlikely to have communication capabilities. Still, he decided to test it just in case. He spat a few globs of saliva at the black beetle. It showed no reaction. As expected, formic acid wasn't the solution. Or perhaps his saliva wasn't pure formic acid. It seemed to contain additional genetic traits from camouflage bugs, whose secretions were used to glue leaves onto their bodies. This left the pheromone-secreting gene as the most likely candidate for communication. Unfortunately, Luo Wen had overlooked this gene when designing the black beetle and hadn't included it in its blueprint. Meanwhile, the black beetle had recovered from its initial post-birth weakness and was now aimlessly wandering around the brood nest's chamber. It almost looked like it was patrolling. Could it be instinctively protecting the brood nest? If so, at least it had some utility. The black beetle's massive mandibles, now adorned with spikes, made it a formidable fighter despite its lack of intelligence. In direct combat, it was probably even stronger than Luo Wen. With the beetle guarding the brood nest, Luo Wen felt more comfortable venturing further afield to explore. Wasting no time, Luo Wen replenished his energy and brought back 2 tree roots. He fed one to the brood nest, but the black beetle unapologetically snatched the other, as if expecting Luo Wen to provide for its needs. Luo Wen cursed under his breath but let it slide. After all, there was no point in arguing with a bug that couldn't understand him. He decided to treat it like a guard dog. After carefully sealing the brood nest's chamber, Luo Wen glanced at the black beetle, which was busy gnawing on its root and oblivious to his actions. Without further delay, he headed for the surface. It had been a while since he'd roamed above ground, thanks to the brood nest weighing him down. The fresh air felt invigorating after so long underground. The surface was far more dangerous than the subterranean world, but Luo Wen had his advantages in both environments. Underground, his rapid digging speed made him nearly impossible to catch. However, his detection range was limited, relying on fine hairs to sense vibrations. This left him vulnerable to stationary threats. Additionally, his speed underground came at the cost of maneuverability, and prolonged digging could damage his compound eyes. Above ground, Luo Wen's sharp vision gave him a significant edge. While most insects were practically blind, he could see clearly over long distances. Stealthy predators like ambush worms, stink bugs, and camouflaged bugs posed less of a threat, as Luo Wen had learned to anticipate their tactics. His highly responsive compound eyes made it nearly impossible for them to catch him off guard. Despite the risks, Luo Wen enjoyed surface exploration. If danger arose, he could always retreat underground, where he excelled. He began circling the brood nest's location in a clockwise pattern, gradually expanding his patrol radius. He was on the lookout for any potential threats, small ones he could eliminate and larger ones he could prepare to escape from. His antennae picked up faint insect noises, and 2 sources stood out within his observational range. Both were black beetles clinging to a tree trunk, their cries sounding almost hysterical. Luo Wen had no intention of provoking them. These creatures were a force he couldn't handle right now. Fortunately, they were herbivores and posed no immediate threat as long as he left them alone. On his 3rd patrol circuit, Luo Wen spotted an ideal target, a perfect subject for experimentation.